Good evening, dear traveler. Midnight Cat is here beside you, quiet as a shadow on a moonlit roof, ready to guide you away from the noise of the present. Settle more deeply into your pillow. Let the room grow still around you, and listen for the soft turning of an older world. Tonight, we will spend a peaceful year in Edo, the great city of wooden bridges, paper lanterns, temple bells, and narrow lanes, where the seasons passed over tiled roofs and the waters of the Sumida carried reflections of clouds toward the sea. What would a year have felt like to someone whose name never entered a chronicle? Not a shogun, nor a famous poet, nor a warrior remembered in painted screens, but an ordinary person who woke before sunrise, swept the dust from a doorstep, counted a few coins, watched the weather, and knew the city through the sound of familiar footsteps. History often preserves ceremonies, fires, decrees, and processions. Yet, between those events lay thousands of quiet mornings, steaming bowls of rice, damp sandals, neighborly greetings, and evenings when the whole city seemed to breathe beneath the moon. Our year begins in the late Edo period, during the first half of the 19th century, when the city already ranked among the largest in the world. The shogun's castle stood at its guarded heart, surrounded by moats, stone walls, official residences, and carefully arranged districts. Beyond them spread an immense patchwork of merchant quarters, artisan neighborhoods, temples, canals, warehouses, gardens, and crowded tenements. Edo was grand from a distance, but close at hand it was made of small things: cedar buckets, woven mats, blue cotton cloth, charcoal braziers, and the thin wooden walls through which one household could hear another cough. In a lane not far from Nihonbashi lived a paper lantern maker named Seibei. He was 42 years old, though long hours bending over bamboo frames had given him the thoughtful posture of someone older. His house was also his workshop, one narrow room opening onto the lane, with a loft above for sleeping. The building formed part of a nagaya, a long wooden tenement divided into modest dwellings, all sharing a well, a refuse area, and a small gate that was closed at night. Seibei lived with his widowed sister, Oharu, and her 12-year-old daughter, Hana. Oharu stitched cloth purses for a nearby seller of tobacco accessories. Hana helped both adults when she was not running errands, learning her characters, or lingering by the canal to watch boats unload baskets of vegetables. The year opened under a pale winter sky. Before dawn, the neighborhood rested beneath a hard, clean cold. Frost silvered the lids of water buckets. Roof tiles held the faintest dusting of white, and the lane smelled of ash from braziers that had gone out during the night. Somewhere beyond the houses a temple bell sounded, each slow note passing over the sleeping city like a ripple across dark water. Seibei woke beneath a thickly padded quilt. The room was almost black. Only a narrow seam of bluish light showed through the wooden shutters. Beside the wall, completed lantern frames hung from hooks, their bamboo ribs casting round, overlapping shadows. He folded the quilt, careful not to wake Hana in the loft, and dressed in layers of cotton. The fabric was cold at first. He tied his sash, slid open the inner panel, and crouched beside the brazier. Yesterday's embers were lifeless, so he arranged charcoal and kindling with practiced fingers. Soon a small flame took hold. It gave little light, but the room slowly began to lose its chill. Oharu descended the steep ladder, her hair loosely gathered. "The well will be frozen at the rim," she murmured. Seibei nodded. "I will break it." They spoke softly, as people did in houses where walls were shared, and privacy was more courtesy than architecture. Outside, the sky had brightened to the color of unglazed porcelain. The lane was only a few paces wide. Wooden facades leaned toward one another, their upper eaves nearly meeting. Seibei crossed to the communal well, where a skin of ice had formed inside the bucket left beneath the rope. He cracked it with the wooden handle of a ladle. The sound was surprisingly sharp. Doors began to slide open along the Nagaya. A sandal maker emerged, yawning into his sleeve. An elderly woman scattered a little water before her threshold, though the ground was already damp with frost. From the gatekeeper's room came the scrape of a broom. The lane awakened not all at once, but gently, household by household. Oharu cooked barley mixed with rice, stretching the more expensive grain. She added pickled daikon and a little miso soup flavored with greens. The soup steamed in lacquered bowls, and Hana warmed her hands around hers before taking the first sip. Beyond the gate, Edo was stirring. Vendors called from shoulder poles balanced across their backs. A tofu seller's wooden clappers made a brisk, hollow sound. A fishmonger passed with shallow tubs, his breath clouding before him. Laborers moved toward the riverfront, and servants hurried on errands for households whose gates were finer and whose kitchens were larger. Seibei lifted the shutters of his workshop. The winter light entered slowly, revealing rolls of paper stacked on a shelf, brushes resting in a ceramic jar, paste in a covered bowl, and thin lengths of bamboo soaking to keep them flexible. On the wall hung 3 finished lanterns, painted with the crest of a small inn. Another, still plain, had been ordered by a noodle seller who wanted bold black characters visible through rain and evening mist. Lanterns were humble companions to the city. They hung outside shops, guided travelers, marked festivals, illuminated pleasure quarters, and swayed in the hands of people returning home after dark. Most would not last many years. Paper tore, frames bent, soot gathered, and fire remained an ever-present danger. Yet Edo depended on objects made to be repaired, replaced, and made again. Seibei selected a strip of bamboo and bent it slowly around a wooden form. The material resisted, then yielded. His fingers knew how much pressure it would bear. Hana sat near the entrance grinding ink. From there she could see the passing lane, the neighbors, and a slice of the larger street beyond. She watched a samurai of modest rank walk by in worn but orderly clothing, followed by a servant carrying a bundle. She watched 2 children spin a wooden top. She watched a monk in a broad hat receive a small offering and bow. To Hana, the city seemed endless. She had crossed Nihonbashi many times and visited temples with her mother, yet whole districts remained only names. There were hills to the west where the air felt clearer, busy quays along the Sumida, daimyo estates behind long walls, and villages beyond the city edges where fields still opened beneath the sky. That morning, as the sun climbed and softened the frost, a messenger arrived from a tea shop near Ryogoku Bridge. The owner wanted 12 lanterns before the first blossoming of the plum trees. Seibei examined the written order. "It is early," Oharu said. "The blossoms may be early too," he replied. Outside, a drop of melting frost fell from the eaves. Then another. Along the lane, water began to shine in the winter sun. And somewhere far beyond the roofs, though no one in the workshop could yet see it, the first plum buds were already gathering themselves upon dark branches. By the next morning, the frost had vanished from the lane, though winter still lingered in the shaded places. Water dripped from the eaves into shallow gutters, and the boards before the workshop darkened where the sun reached them. Seibei began the tea shop order at once, sorting the strongest bamboo strips and unrolling paper that was pale, smooth, and nearly without blemish. The 12 lanterns were to bear the name of the shop in flowing black characters, with a small plum blossom painted beneath. Such signs did more than announce a place. In a city where many people read familiar symbols more readily than long inscriptions, the shape of a crest, the sweep of a brushstroke, or the color of a curtain could guide a customer as surely as a street name. Hana watched Seibei prepare the first frame. He bent one strip around the wooden form, fixed it with fine cord, and added another. Slowly, an empty shape appeared, delicate but firm. It seemed almost impossible that so light a thing could survive rain, smoke, wind, and the careless handling of customers returning home at night. Oharu worked near the brazier, sewing tiny drawstring pouches from scraps of striped cotton. Her needle rose and fell in a quiet rhythm. Every so often she paused to warm her fingers, then resumed without complaint. Outside, the lane had become lively. A peddler called out combs and hairpins. A woman carrying a child stopped at the well. The sandal-maker argued mildly with a supplier over the quality of a bundle of rushes. From an upper window came the dry flutter of bedding being aired. Before midday, Seibei wrapped 2 finished repairs in cloth and set out for Nihonbashi. Hana asked to accompany him, and after a glance at the sky, he agreed. They stepped through the Nagaya gate and entered the broader street, where the city gathered around them in layers of sound. Wooden clogs struck packed earth. Porters called warnings as they carried heavy loads. Shop curtains shifted in the breeze. Somewhere nearby, a shamisen player was practicing the same phrase again and again, each attempt floating above the street before dissolving into the noise. Nihonbashi was not far, but the walk passed through a world of trades. There were shops selling dried bonito, paper, brushes, medicines, tea, cloth, and lacquerware. Some displayed their goods openly. Others relied on hanging signs or familiar crests. Apprentices swept thresholds, merchants leaned over account books, and delivery men moved with the speed of people who knew every alley. The bridge itself arched over a canal crowded with boats. Hana always slowed there. Below, men unloaded baskets of fish packed in straw. Barges carrying rice and firewood pressed close to the embankments. The water was dark, disturbed by poles, oars, and the passing wakes of narrow craft. Gulls cried overhead, and the air held the mixed smells of river mud, wet rope, salt fish, and smoke. Nihonbashi marked the point from which distances along the great roads of Japan were measured. Travelers departing toward Kyoto, the northern provinces, or the mountain routes might begin their journeys from this crowded crossing. Yet to Hana it was less a symbol of the realm than a place of constant motion, where almost anything might arrive. She rested her hands on the railing. "Where does that boat come from?" she asked, pointing toward a vessel loaded with round wooden tubs. "Perhaps from the coast," Seibei said, "or from a warehouse farther downriver." He did not pretend to know. In Edo, even familiar goods had often traveled farther than the people who used them. They delivered the first repair to a shop that sold writing brushes. The owner inspected the lantern carefully, pressing the new paper with one finger, then nodded and counted out the agreed coins. The second belonged to a medicine seller whose old lantern had been scorched near the top. Seibei had replaced the damaged panel and strengthened the frame. On the way home, they paused before a print seller's shop. Several woodblock prints were displayed beneath the eaves, protected from damp by a shallow awning. One showed a view of Mount Fuji beyond the city roofs. Another depicted women beneath plum branches, their robes patterned with fine lines of blue and gray. Hana studied the blossoms. "They have opened already in the picture," she said. "In pictures, spring may arrive whenever the artist wishes." She smiled at that, though Seibei suspected she was already thinking of the tea-shop lanterns. Near the bridge, a seller offered roasted sweet potatoes from a heated stone box. Seibei bought one and divided it with Hana. Steam rose from the yellow flesh. They ate slowly as they walked, warming their hands through the paper wrapping. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered over Edo, soft and low. The light turned silver. In the workshop, Seibei pasted paper over the first completed frames, smoothing each section with the flat of his hand. When the paste dried, the paper tightened and gave the lantern its familiar form. Hana practiced painting plum blossoms on scraps. Her first attempts were too round. The second looked like stars. The third had petals of unequal size, but there was something alive in it, as if a breeze had just touched the branch. Oharu looked over her shoulder. "That one is pleasant." Hana dipped the brush again, trying not to appear too pleased. In the days that followed, the cold loosened its hold. The sun remained longer over the roofs, and the lane no longer fell into darkness before the evening meal was prepared. Sparrows returned to the gutters. The water seller's voice seemed less lonely in the morning air. Then, on a clear day when the wind came softly from the south, word passed through the neighborhood that the plum trees at Kameido had begun to bloom. The news traveled as such news did, carried by customers, apprentices, servants, and women returning from market. By noon, everyone seemed to know, though few had seen the flowers themselves. Seibei had finished 8 of the 12 lanterns. The tea-shop owner's deadline was no longer distant. He worked steadily through the afternoon, but at sunset he set down his brush and flexed his aching fingers. The room smelled of paste, ink, charcoal, and cooked daikon. The new lanterns stood in a row along the wall, pale and unlit. Hana held up the scrap with her best plum blossom. "Uncle," she said, "could one of them have flowers like this?" Seibei looked at the small painting, then at the undecorated lantern before him. The petals were not perfect. Their edges wandered slightly, and the branch leaned more than a practiced painter might have allowed. Yet they carried the uncertain freshness of the season itself. He moved the inkstone toward her. "Only one," he said. And slowly. Hana knelt beside the lantern. Outside, the last daylight faded from the lane, while above the city, invisible beyond the roofs, a thin moon was rising into the quiet spring sky. Hana lowered the brush until its tip touched the paper. For a moment, nothing moved except the flame in the brazier. Then the first dark line appeared, thin at the beginning and fuller as she turned her wrist. She painted the branch before the blossoms, just as Seibei had taught her to build a lantern from its hidden frame outward. The line bent gently across the white surface. Smaller twigs opened from it, and upon them she placed 5-petaled flowers, each made with a quiet press and lift of the brush. Seibei watched without correcting her. The lantern rested between them like a small moon not yet given light. Hana's breathing had become so careful that Oharu, still sewing near the wall, looked up and smiled. When the final blossom was finished, Hana sat back on her heels. One flower leaned too close to another. A drop of ink had thickened the end of a twig. Yet the design seemed to belong to the lantern more naturally than the formal pattern Seibei had intended. "It will do," he said. Hana's shoulders relaxed. They left the lantern untouched overnight. Paper remembered every careless finger while the ink was wet, and patience was part of nearly every useful craft. In the loft, Hana lay beneath the quilt listening to the Nagaya settle. A baby cried in a nearby room and was soothed. Someone coughed behind a thin wall. Farther away, a night watchman struck wooden clappers and called a warning to be cautious with fire. That warning passed through Edo every night. Fire lived in cooking stoves, braziers, lamps, bathhouses, workshops, and the lanterns that Seibei made. In a city built largely from wood and paper, flame was both servant and threat. Buckets stood ready along the lanes, and neighborhood groups were expected to respond when alarm bells sounded. Many residents knew the uneasy experience of waking to a red sky, gathering what they could carry, and waiting to learn whether the wind would spare their street. But this night remained calm. The watchman's clappers faded, and the moon crossed unseen above the roofs. At dawn, Seibei examined Hana's work in the cool light. The ink had dried to a soft black, with faint variations where the brush had held more water. He added the tea shop's name on the opposite side, his larger characters balancing the slender branch. The final 4 lanterns were completed before the end of the week. To deliver them, Seibei borrowed a carrying pole and packed the lanterns inside 2 light wooden frames, 6 on each side. He wrapped them against dust and unexpected rain. Hana came with him again, wearing a blue cotton jacket Oharu had recently mended at the elbows. Their route led eastward through streets that grew busier near Ryogoku. The day was mild enough for shopkeepers to raise their shutters fully. Steam drifted from food stalls. A seller of medicinal tooth powder demonstrated his wares with an energetic patter, while a man nearby balanced spinning bowls on thin sticks for a ring of delighted children. The closer they came to the bridge, the wider the sky seemed. Ryogoku crossed the Sumida, linking the dense quarters of the city with the districts beyond the river. Its approaches were famous for crowds and entertainments. Temporary stalls gathered there, along with tea houses, performers, vendors, and travelers who paused to watch the water. Seibei walked carefully beneath the swaying load. The river shone under the pale spring sun. Ferries and cargo boats passed below, their boatmen calling to one another. Along the banks, warehouses stood with heavy white-plastered walls designed to resist fire. Beyond them rose temple roofs, bare branches, and a faint haze that softened the city's eastern edge. The tea shop occupied a narrow building near the bridge approach. Its entrance was marked by a dark blue Norin curtain, faded from weather, and a shelf where kettles cooled between servings. The owner, a round-faced man named Genshichi, came outside as soon as he saw Seibei. "You have brought spring with you," he said. The lanterns were unpacked one by one. Genshichi inspected the frames, the paper, and the lettering. When he reached the lantern with Hana's branch, he turned it slowly. She stood beside Seibei, trying to look at the street rather than at his expression. "This blossom is different," Genshichi said. Seibei did not answer immediately. "My niece painted it." Genshichi looked at Hana, then back at the lantern. "Then this one will hang nearest the door." He paid the full price and added 2 small rice cakes dusted with soybean flour. One was for Seibei and one for Hana, though Hana saved half of hers for Oharu. Before leaving, they watched the new lanterns being hung beneath the eaves. In daylight, they seemed modest, almost weightless. At evening, candles would warm the paper from within, and the shop's name would glow above the passing crowd. Hana's plum branch would appear in silhouette, its imperfect flowers dark against amber light. Their work finished, Seibei allowed them to follow the road beyond the bridge toward Kamedo. Others had made the same decision. Families, servants on errands, craftsmen enjoying a free hour, and groups of young apprentices moved eastward in cheerful streams. Some carried food wrapped in cloth. Others held folded fans, though the air was not yet warm enough to need them. The city thinned gradually. Houses gave way to temple grounds, gardens, patches of cultivated earth, and stretches where the wind could move freely. The smell of mud and new grass rose from the roadside. After the enclosed lanes near Nihonbashi, the open sky felt immense. At Kamaido, the plum trees were waiting. Their branches twisted darkly over paths, ponds, and low garden fences, covered with blossoms white, rose, and pale pink. Some trees were ancient in appearance, trained and supported so their limbs extended like careful calligraphy. Beneath them, visitors moved slowly, speaking in subdued voices as if the flowers required gentleness. Hana stopped at the first tree. The blossoms were smaller than those in prints. Some had already loosened and lay upon the ground. Others remained in tight buds. Their fragrance was faint but distinct, clean and slightly sweet in the cool air. Seibei found a place near the edge of a pond. They ate the rice cakes while sunlight moved across the water. A duck passed through the reflection of a flowering branch, breaking it into wavering pieces. Nearby, an old man composed a verse aloud for his companions, then forgot the final line and laughed. A woman adjusted the scarf around a child's neck. Two apprentices compared blossoms as seriously as merchants examining cloth. Hana looked from the trees to the scrap of paper she had tucked into her sleeve, the one bearing her practice flowers. "They are not shaped as I painted them," she said. "No," Seibei replied, "but tomorrow they will not be shaped exactly as they are today." A breeze crossed the garden. Several petals released their hold and drifted toward the pond, turning in the air before touching the surface. Hana watched them settle. The year had scarcely begun, and already it was changing. On their return from Kameido, the afternoon light had already begun to mellow. The road back toward Ryogoku carried the soft dust of many sandals, and the crowds moved more slowly now, as though everyone had borrowed something of the garden's calm. Hana kept the practice paper tucked safely in her sleeve. From time to time she touched it with 2 fingers, reassuring herself that it was still there. At the bridge, the river had changed color. Morning silver had deepened into a muted blue, streaked with bronze where the sun leaned westward. Boats crossed one another below in steady patterns, some bound toward the warehouses, others turning downstream toward the bay. A barge piled high with firewood passed beneath them, its load rising like a small moving hill. The new lanterns already hung outside Genshichi's tea shop. They were unlit, but Hana recognized her branch at once. It faced the street, exactly as the owner had promised. A gust stirred the row, and for an instant all 12 lanterns turned together, revealing blank paper, bold lettering, and the single painted spray of plum in quiet succession. Seibei did not pause long. Work waited at home, and the city gates of the smaller neighborhoods would not remain open without limit. Yet, as they walked on, he said, "In the evening, someone may notice it." Hana looked back once. Someone who has seen the real blossoms? Perhaps, or someone who has not. That answer pleased her more than praise might have done. By the time they reached the Nagaya, Oharu had prepared buckwheat noodles with chopped scallion. The room was warm from cooking, and the familiar smell of charcoal clung to the rafters. Hana gave her mother the saved half of the rice cake, though it had become slightly crushed inside its wrapping. Oharu accepted it as if it were an expensive gift. They ate while Hana described the garden. She told of branches supported by wooden posts, petals floating on the pond, and the old man who had forgotten his verse. She said nothing about her own painted lantern until Seibei mentioned where Genshichi had chosen to hang it. Oharu turned toward her daughter. Nearest the door? Hana lowered her eyes to her bowl, but her smile remained visible. Outside, neighbors drew water before nightfall. Doors slid shut one after another, and the lane narrowed into darkness. Soon the night watchman's clappers sounded beyond the gate, steady and dry beneath the deepening sky. Spring did not arrive in Edo on a single morning. It entered through small changes. The rice seller began leaving his door open longer in the afternoon. Bedding appeared across balconies to air in the sun. Children played in the lane without hurrying back to the brazier. The first insects found the paper screens, tapping faintly at dusk. Rain came more often, sometimes as a fine mist that seemed to hang between the roofs, sometimes in silver threads that filled gutters and polished every stone. For Seibei, the damp weather brought careful work. Paper behaved differently when the air was wet. It softened, stretched, and took longer to dry. He learned to judge the room before applying paste, and on rainy days he left more space between finished lanterns so that none touched another. Orders increased as the season advanced. An inn requested replacements for lanterns faded by winter wind. A bathhouse wanted 2 large signs with red lettering. A small shrine asked for 6 plain lanterns to be offered by local worshippers. Seibei worked from morning until the light failed, and Hana's duties multiplied beside his. She trimmed paper, mixed paste, and tied cord around completed frames. At first, her knots slipped. Seibei showed her how to cross the strands and pull them evenly, not with force but with patience. By the end of the month, her hands remembered. Oharu continued sewing, though she sometimes joined them in the workshop when a large order had to be wrapped. Their household moved according to the work before it. Meals became simpler on busy days. Conversation shortened. Yet the labor was not unpleasant. The room held the quiet concentration of 3 people making things that would soon travel into streets they might never see. One rainy afternoon, a woman arrived carrying a broken lantern beneath her cloak. She was the proprietress of a small sweet shop several lanes away. The lantern had fallen during a night storm, tearing 2 panels and splitting 1 bamboo rib. She placed it on the work table with an apologetic sigh. "It was made by my husband," she said, "many years ago." Seibei examined it. The paper had yellowed. Soot darkened the upper rim, and the painted characters were faded almost to gray. A new lantern would have been easier and possibly cheaper than repairing it carefully. "The frame is weak," he said. "I can replace the broken rib, but the others may not last." "I understand." He turned the lantern once more. Near the base, almost hidden by age, was a tiny painted sparrow. "Did he paint this as well?" The woman nodded. "He put one on everything he made." Seibei glanced toward Hana. She was sorting bamboo strips near the wall, but he knew she was listening. "I will preserve it," he said. For 2 days, the old lantern occupied the most protected corner of the workshop. Seibei removed the damaged paper without disturbing the panel bearing the sparrow. He replaced the broken rib, strengthened the joints, and cut new paper to match the color of the old as closely as possible. Fresh white would have looked too bright beside the surviving pieces, so he brushed the new sheets with weak tea and allowed them to dry. Hana watched every stage. "Why not paint another sparrow?" she asked. "Because this one was made by his hand." "But the new paper is yours." "Yes." She considered this while grinding ink. "So the lantern belongs to both makers now?" Seibei smiled slightly, "and to the woman who kept it." When the proprietress returned, she lifted the restored lantern with both hands. The old sparrow remained near the base, small and faded, perched beneath paper that now held firm again. For a moment she said nothing. Then she bowed, paid Seibei, and carried it away beneath a clear evening sky. That night, Hana stood outside the workshop after the others had gone in. The rain had washed the lane clean. Water still shone in the grooves between the boards, reflecting slivers of light from open doorways. Above the rooftops, clouds were breaking apart. She thought of the lantern traveling back to its sweet shop, of her plum branch near Ryogoku Bridge, and of all the small painted signs scattered through Edo, each holding the trace of someone's hand. A mild wind moved through the lane. Far away, beyond walls, canals, and temple roofs, the cherry trees were preparing to bloom. On their return from Kamaido, the afternoon light had already begun to mellow. The road back toward Ryogoku carried the soft dust of many sandals, and the crowds moved more slowly now, as though everyone had borrowed something of the garden's calm. Hana kept the practice paper tucked safely in her sleeve. From time to time she touched it with 2 fingers, reassuring herself that it was still there. At the bridge, the river had changed color. Morning silver had deepened into a muted blue, streaked with bronze where the sun leaned westward. Boats crossed one another below in steady patterns, some bound toward the warehouses, others turning downstream toward the bay. A barge piled high with firewood passed beneath them, its load rising like a small moving hill. The new lanterns already hung outside Genshichi's tea shop. They were unlit, but Hana recognized her branch at once. It faced the street, exactly as the owner had promised. A gust stirred the row, and for an instant all 12 lanterns turned together, revealing blank paper, bold lettering, and the single painted spray of plum in quiet succession. Seibei did not pause long. Work waited at home, and the city gates of the smaller neighborhoods would not remain open without limit. Yet, as they walked on, he said, "In the evening, someone may notice it." Hana looked back once. Someone who has seen the real blossoms? Perhaps. Or someone who has not. That answer pleased her more than praise might have done. By the time they reached the Nagaya, Oharu had prepared buckwheat noodles with chopped scallion. The room was warm from cooking, and the familiar smell of charcoal clung to the rafters. Hana gave her mother the saved half of the rice cake, though it had become slightly crushed inside its wrapping. Oharu accepted it as if it were an expensive gift. They ate while Hana described the garden. She told of branches supported by wooden posts, petals floating on the pond, and the old man who had forgotten his verse. She said nothing about her own painted lantern until Seibei mentioned where Genshichi had chosen to hang it. Oharu turned toward her daughter. "Nearest the door?" Hana lowered her eyes to her bowl, but her smile remained visible. Outside, neighbors drew water before nightfall. Doors slid shut one after another, and the lane narrowed into darkness. Soon the night watchman's clappers sounded beyond the gate, steady and dry beneath the deepening sky. Spring did not arrive in Edo on a single morning. It entered through small changes. The rice seller began leaving his door open longer in the afternoon. Bedding appeared across balconies to air in the sun. Children played in the lane without hurrying back to the brazier. The first insects found the paper screens, tapping faintly at dusk. Rain came more often, sometimes as a fine mist that seemed to hang between the roofs, sometimes in silver threads that filled gutters and polished every stone. For Seibei, the damp weather brought careful work. Paper behaved differently when the air was wet. It softened, stretched, and took longer to dry. He learned to judge the room before applying paste, and on rainy days he left more space between finished lanterns so that none touched another. Orders increased as the season advanced. An inn requested replacements for lanterns faded by winter wind. A bathhouse wanted 2 large signs with red lettering. A small shrine asked for 6 plain lanterns to be offered by local worshippers. Seibei worked from morning until the light failed, and Hana's duties multiplied beside his. She trimmed paper, mixed paste, and tied cord around completed frames. At first, her knots slipped. Seibei showed her how to cross the strands and pull them evenly, not with force but with patience. By the end of the month, her hands remembered. Oharu continued sewing, though she sometimes joined them in the workshop when a large order had to be wrapped. Their household moved according to the work before it. Meals became simpler on busy days. Conversation shortened. Yet the labor was not unpleasant. The room held the quiet concentration of 3 people making things that would soon travel into streets they might never see. One rainy afternoon, a woman arrived carrying a broken lantern beneath her cloak. She was the proprietress of a small sweet shop several lanes away. The lantern had fallen during a night storm, tearing 2 panels and splitting 1 bamboo rib. She placed it on the work table with an apologetic sigh. "It was made by my husband," she said. "Many years ago." Seibei examined it. The paper had yellowed. Soot darkened the upper rim, and the painted characters were faded almost to gray. A new lantern would have been easier and possibly cheaper than repairing it carefully. "The frame is weak," he said. "I can replace the broken rib, but the others may not last." "I understand." He turned the lantern once more. Near the base, almost hidden by age, was a tiny painted sparrow. "Did he paint this as well?" The woman nodded. "He put one on everything he made." Seibei glanced toward Hana. She was sorting bamboo strips near the wall, but he knew she was listening. "I will preserve it," he said. For 2 days, the old lantern occupied the most protected corner of the workshop. Seibei removed the damaged paper without disturbing the panel bearing the sparrow. He replaced the broken rib, strengthened the joints, and cut new paper to match the color of the old as closely as possible. Fresh white would have looked too bright beside the surviving pieces, so he brushed the new sheets with weak tea and allowed them to dry. Hana watched every stage. "Why not paint another sparrow?" she asked. "Because this one was made by his hand." "But the new paper is yours." "Yes." She considered this while grinding ink. "So the lantern belongs to both makers now?" Seibei smiled slightly. "And to the woman who kept it." When the proprietress returned, she lifted the restored lantern with both hands. The old sparrow remained near the base, small and faded, perched beneath paper that now held firm again. For a moment she said nothing. Then she bowed, paid Seibei, and carried it away beneath a clear evening sky. That night, Hana stood outside the workshop after the others had gone in. The rain had washed the lane clean. Water still shone in the grooves between the boards, reflecting slivers of light from open doorways. Above the rooftops, clouds were breaking apart. She thought of the lantern traveling back to its sweet shop, of her plum branch near Ryogoku Bridge, and of all the small painted signs scattered through Edo, each holding the trace of someone's hand. A mild wind moved through the lane. Far away, beyond walls, canals, and temple roofs, the cherry trees were preparing to bloom. The cherry blossoms did not open all at once. For several mornings, the branches above temple walls and garden fences seemed merely dusted with pale color. Then a mild wind came from the south, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant river water, and the city awoke beneath clouds of white and faintest pink. News of the flowering traveled through Edo with remarkable speed. A fish seller announced that the trees at Ueno were nearly full. A customer at the workshop insisted that the finest blossoms stood along the Sumida. At the well, one neighbor praised Asakayama, while another declared it too crowded to be peaceful. Hana listened to every report. She had never seen the city so eagerly distracted. Apprentices found reasons to make deliveries near famous groves. Servants hurried through the lanes carrying picnic boxes. Vendors prepared rice cakes colored green, white, and rose. Even those who could not leave their work placed flowering twigs in small jars or paused beneath a branch on the way home. Seibei, however, had 3 orders to finish. The workshop filled with frames awaiting paper. One belonged to an inn, another to a bathhouse, and 6 smaller lanterns were intended for a neighborhood shrine. Damp air slowed the pace, and there was little room to leave the finished pieces untouched while they dried. Hana worked beside him without complaint, though each time voices passed the gate discussing blossoms, her hands moved a little more slowly. Oharu noticed. "The flowers will not fall today," she said. "They might," Hana replied. "Not all of them." Seibei tested the tension of a paper panel with his fingertips. "If we finish the shrine lanterns before midday tomorrow," he said, "we may walk to the river." Hana's brush immediately regained its speed. The next morning began bright and still. Sunlight entered the workshop in a narrow golden band, illuminating flecks of dust, bamboo shavings, and the fine hairs of the brushes. By the time the temple bell sounded late morning, the 6 shrine lanterns stood completed in a row. Seibei examined each one. Hana had trimmed the paper cleanly and tied every cord without a loose end. He closed the shutters. Oharu packed rice balls seasoned with sesame, pickled vegetables, and a little sweet bean paste. She wrapped the containers in cloth, while Hana rolled a reed mat and tied it with string. They walked eastward through streets transformed by spring. Fresh shop curtains hung above open entrances. Bedding aired from upper windows. Children carried pinwheels that spun in the mild breeze. Blossoms rose above walls and gates, their branches bright against dark roof tiles. In some lanes, petals had already begun to gather in gutters like scraps of pale paper. Near the river, the crowds thickened. Families, artisans, clerks, servants, pilgrims, and wandering vendors moved together beneath the trees. Some wore their best garments, though few were rich. Blue and brown cotton robes formed a quiet river of color along the embankment, interrupted by patterned sleeves, bright sashes, and the occasional gleam of silk. The Sumida flowed beside them, broad and patient. Boats crossed its surface in every direction. Ferries carried passengers from bank to bank. Barges moved beneath bundles of timber and firewood. A narrow craft, loaded with baskets of vegetables, left a widening wake that broke the reflections of the flowering trees. Seibei chose a place away from the loudest gatherings, beneath an old cherry whose roots had lifted the earth into a comfortable rise. The three of them spread their mat where they could see both the river and the long curve of blossoms along the bank. For a while they simply sat. The city remained noisy, yet beneath the tree its sounds softened into layers. There were distant calls from boatmen, the murmur of conversation, the clap of sandals on packed ground, and somewhere upstream the thin music of a flute. Above these drifted the faint stirring of branches. Oharu poured tea. Hana held her cup near her face and breathed in the steam. The blossoms overhead had almost no strong fragrance, but the air carried other signs of the season. Warm grass, river mud, grilled fish from a nearby stall, charcoal smoke, and the sweetness of rice cakes. A petal landed in her tea. She studied it for a moment before lifting it out with one finger. "It looks different when it falls," she said. "Most things do," Seibei answered. Nearby, a group of young shop clerks sang with more enthusiasm than skill. An elderly couple shared their meal in silence. A mother adjusted a cloth over a sleeping child, protecting his face from the drifting petals. Hana watched all of them. She had expected the blossoms to be the most memorable part of the day, yet the people beneath them seemed equally important. Everyone knew the flowering would be brief. Perhaps that was why they ate carefully, laughed easily, and looked upward more often than usual. After the meal, Hana collected fallen blossoms and arranged them on the mat. Some were white, others faintly pink at the center. She tried to make a 5-petaled lantern shape like the one she had once imagined, but the wind scattered her design before she completed it. Seibei observed the petals turning across the grass. "A frame like that would be difficult," he said. Hana looked at him. "You remembered." "I remember troublesome ideas." She smiled and began arranging the petals again. As afternoon moved toward evening, lanterns appeared beneath the trees. People lit them one by one, sheltering each flame with a hand. Warm circles of light emerged among the pale branches, dim at first, then brighter as the sky deepened to blue. Some lanterns bore family crests, others carried shop names, poems, birds, or flowers. Their light touched the blossoms from below, turning the petals gold along their edges. Hana looked closely at the painted designs. She wondered who had made each frame, who had stretched the paper, and whose brush had left the marks now glowing over the river bank. Somewhere in the city, perhaps, those makers sat beneath other trees, unaware that strangers were admiring their work. The thought made Edo seem both vast and intimate. When the air grew cool, Oharu folded the food cloths, and Seibei rolled the mat. Hana rose reluctantly. Beneath her sandals, petals had gathered so thickly that the ground appeared lightly covered with snow. They joined the slow procession home. At Ryogoku, the tea shops had lit their evening lanterns. Hana's painted plum branch still hung nearest Genshichi's door. The season it represented had passed, yet the little flowers glowed steadily while cherry petals drifted around them. A young girl paused beneath the lantern and pointed upward. Her mother glanced at the painted branch, then guided her inside. Hana continued walking without speaking, but warmth spread quietly through her chest. Behind them, the Sumida carried broken reflections of lanterns downstream. Ahead lay the familiar narrow lanes, the workshop, and another day of work. Above the roofs, petals moved through the evening air, falling softly over Edo. By morning, petals lay in the Nagaya lane like pale scraps left by a careless paper cutter. They had traveled farther than Hana expected. The nearest flowering trees stood beyond the crowded roofs, yet the wind had carried their blossoms over walls, canals, and marketplaces. Some floated in the communal well. Others clung to damp sandals or rested along the threshold of Seibei's workshop, where they trembled whenever someone passed. Hana swept them into a small heap. For a moment she considered saving the cleanest ones, but the petals had already begun to brown at their edges. She tipped them into the refuse basket and watched the last few escape the broom, turning softly across the boards. Inside, the workshop was busy again. The merchant beyond the canal had sent a formal order for 20 summer lanterns, each bearing a different flower. The lanterns were intended for a neighborhood celebration in the 6th month, when evenings would be warm, and people would gather near the local shrine. They need not be grand, the message explained, but no 2 designs should be alike. Seibei read the order twice. 20 flowers, Hana said. 20 recognizable flowers, he replied. Oharu looked up from her sewing. That makes the matter more difficult. Hana began naming those she knew: plum, cherry, iris, chrysanthemum, morning glory, peony, lotus. She paused after 7. Wisteria, Oharu added. Bellflower, said Seibei. They continued until the list reached 12, then slowed. Edo's gardens and fields offered no shortage of plants, but turning each one into a clear painted emblem was another matter. A customer viewing the lantern in evening light should not have to wonder whether it displayed a flower, a cloud, or a badly drawn vegetable. Seibei took a sheet of inexpensive paper and wrote the names in a neat column. Beside each, he left room for a sketch. For the next several days, the work gave Hana a new way of seeing the city. A flower cellar became a place of study. She lingered over buckets of cut branches and potted plants, noting how leaves joined stems and how petals folded around one another. At a temple gate, she examined carved lotus blossoms darkened by years of rain. She found tiny violets growing near a wall and crouched so long to observe them that a passing neighbor asked whether she had lost a coin. Even familiar designs on cloth began to seem useful. Oharu possessed a faded sash patterned with small autumn grasses. The bathhouse curtain bore stylized irises. On a customer's tobacco pouch, silver thread formed a spray of bush clover. Seibei warned Hana that a lantern painting could not contain every detail. Choose what the eye remembers, he said. He showed her by painting an iris. 3 firm leaves rose behind the flower. The petals required only a few blue strokes, but the downward curve of one outer petal made the plant unmistakable. The true flower has more lines, Hana observed. The lantern will be seen from across a street. She practiced beside him. Her first iris looked heavy, as though rain had bent it. Her second stood too straight. The third seemed to open naturally from the stem. Spring continued beyond the workshop. The cherry branches thinned and turned green. Young leaves appeared so quickly that Hana could almost believe they had been waiting behind the blossoms. Rain washed the remaining petals into drains and canals. The air grew softer, and on clear mornings sunlight reached the floorboards earlier than before. The neighborhood changed its daily habits. Doors remained open. Cooking was done closer to the entrance so heat would not gather inside. Children returned to the well flushed from play. A goldfish seller passed through the streets with round glass bowls suspended from his carrying pole, flashes of red moving within them like bits of living lacquer. One afternoon, Hana followed his call to the gate. The bowls caught the sunlight. Water trembled with each step, making the fish appear to bend and divide. Several children gathered around, pressing close until the seller gently told them to stand back. Hana owned no bowl suitable for a fish, and even the smallest cost more than she wished to spend. Still, she remained until the seller lifted his pole and disappeared into the next lane. When she returned, Seibei had begun shaping the first frames for the summer order. These lanterns were smaller than the signs outside shops. Each could be folded flat for storage, then opened when needed. Bamboo spiraled around the frame in a continuous line, giving the paper support while allowing it to collapse. Hana watched the structure lengthen beneath his hands. "It resembles a spring," she said. Seibei glanced at her. "Do not press it to see whether it behaves like one." She placed her hands behind her back. The flower designs were divided among them according to skill. Seibei would paint the peony, lotus, chrysanthemum, and other forms requiring confident brushwork. Hana was given plum, bellflower, morning glory, clover, and several simple blossoms. Oharu, who claimed she could not paint, agreed to prepare colors and keep the finished list so none would be repeated. Their evenings settled into a gentle rhythm. After supper, Seibei sketched by lamplight. Hana ground mineral and vegetable pigments in shallow dishes. Oharu mixed paste and told them when a flower looked too much like another. The workshop filled with soft reds, muted blues, leaf greens, and the warm yellow of late summer grasses. They did not work only from memory. On a free afternoon, the three of them visited a plant market held near a temple. Gardeners had brought the pots arranged on low platforms, dwarf pines, flowering shrubs, herbs, and young trees trained into pleasing shapes. Vendors shaded the more delicate plants with woven screens. Water darkened the ground beneath the pots, and the air smelled of wet soil. Hana found a morning glory vine climbing a slender support. Only one flower remained open in the afternoon, its blue petals already beginning to fold. "So quickly?" she asked. "It opened at dawn," the seller said. "By evening it will be finished." She leaned closer, studying the pale center and the fine lines spreading through the blue. Nearby, wisteria hung from a wooden trellis in long purple clusters. Their flowering season was nearly past, but enough remained for Seibei to trace the way the blossoms descended from the stem. Oharu admired a pot of small white lilies, then walked away before the seller could persuade her to buy it. They returned through streets warmed by the afternoon sun. At a canal crossing, Hana stopped to look at weeds growing between the embankment stones. Tiny yellow flowers rose there, ignored by nearly everyone. "Could one of those be painted?" she asked. Seibei rested the bundle of sketches against his shoulder. "It could." "Would the merchant know what it was?" "Perhaps not." Hana considered this. "But someone might." Seibei looked down at the small flowers, bright against gray stone. He added one more name to the list. That evening, the first summer insects began their thin, steady singing beneath the eaves. The sound entered through the open shutters and remained after the lamps were lit. On the wall, unfinished lanterns hung in a pale row, waiting for flowers gathered from gardens, markets, cloth patterns, temple carvings, and cracks between stones. Outside, the last cherry petal in the lane loosened from the edge of the well and drifted away into the warm night. By the time the 20-flower lanterns were finished, the rains had settled over Edo. They came first as brief showers that darkened the lane and left the roofs shining. Then the sky closed into a long season of gray. Water drummed softly on tiles, slipped from the eaves in steady threads, and gathered beneath the Nagaya gate until the earth became dark and yielding. The city did not stop for rain. Vendors covered their baskets with oiled paper. Travelers lifted the hems of their robes. Porters bent beneath straw capes that shed water in narrow streams. Wooden clogs splashed through puddles, and umbrellas moved along the larger streets like round, slow blossoms in shades of brown and blue. Inside the workshop, the air smelled of damp wood, rice paste, and drying paper. Seibei kept a small charcoal fire burning even when the day was warm. Too much heat could warp the bamboo, but without it the lanterns would remain soft and loose. He shifted the finished pieces from one beam to another, judging where the air moved best. The 20 designs hung around the room. There were familiar flowers from gardens and festival robes: peony, iris, lotus, wisteria, chrysanthemum, morning glory. There were quieter plants as well: clover, bellflower, pinks, shepherd's purse, and the little yellow blossom Hana had discovered between the canal stones. That lantern had become her favorite. She had painted 3 slender stems rising from a patch of green, each bearing a flower no larger than her thumbnail. Against the lantern's broad paper surface, they seemed almost too modest. Yet when Seibei lit a candle inside to test the design, the yellow petals appeared warm and clear, as though a little piece of sunlight had survived the rainy season. Oharu stood back to inspect the whole set. "No two alike," she said. "No two exactly as they grow either," Hana replied. "That is fortunate. We could not fit a garden inside the room." The merchant's assistants arrived near midday with carrying frames. Each lantern was folded, wrapped, and placed between thin boards to protect the painted paper. Hana checked the list while Seibei counted the bundles. When the last one had been tied securely, the workshop looked unexpectedly bare. For weeks, the flower lanterns had filled every corner. Their colors had brightened even the darkest mornings. Now only hooks, cords, and a few stray bamboo shavings remained. The merchant's chief assistant counted out the payment. "The neighborhood will light them on the 7th evening of the 7th month," he said. "Oh, weather permitting." The festival of the 7th night honored the meeting of 2 stars, known through an old tale that had traveled to Japan from China long before. According to the story, the weaver maiden and the herdsman were separated by the river of heaven and allowed to meet only once each year. If rain filled the sky, their meeting might be delayed, though different regions told the tale in different ways. Hana looked toward the open shutter, where rain fell without pause. "Does the sky ever become clear in the 7th month?" she asked after the assistants had left. "Sometimes," Seibei said, "and if it does not, people still write their wishes." In the days before the festival, colored paper strips appeared throughout Edo. People wrote hopes for improved skill, successful work, good health, or harmony within the household, then tied the papers to branches of bamboo. Outside schools and shops, the narrow strips stirred in the wet wind. Hana received 3 scraps from the brush seller near Nihonbashi. She gave one to Oharu and one to Seibei. Her mother wrote privately, folded the strip once, and tied it to a bamboo stem placed in a jar beside the workshop. Seibei stared at his paper for some time before writing a few small characters. Hana knew at once what she wished for. She wanted her hands to become steady enough to paint any flower Seibei named. Yet when she lifted the brush, the wish seemed both too simple and too large. She thought of lanterns glowing in streets she had never visited, of the old sparrow preserved on repaired paper, and of the 20 flowers waiting for their summer evening. At last she wrote that she wished to make useful things beautifully. She tied the strip below Seibei's. The rain continued on the morning of the 7th day. It whispered against the shutters while they ate breakfast. It fell during the delivery of 2 repaired shop signs. It followed Hana to the market, where she bought eggplants, young ginger, and a bundle of greens from farmers sheltering beneath woven mats. By afternoon, the clouds had become lighter, but no less thick. The Nagaya children made their own festival decorations. They cut paper into nets, folded cranes, and tied bright scraps to a shared bamboo branch near the well. Moisture curled the edges, and several pieces had to be replaced after the ink began to run. Toward evening, the rain weakened. No one trusted the change at first. People continued beneath umbrellas, and water still slipped from the roofs. Then a child at the gate called that there was light in the west. Hana hurried outside. A narrow opening had appeared beneath the clouds. The sun, already near the horizon, shone through it in a band of muted gold. The wet lane reflected the color. Every roof tile, bucket rim, and hanging drop seemed briefly illuminated. Above the western houses, the clouds separated. The clearing spread slowly, revealing patches of deepening blue. Neighbors emerged from their rooms. Umbrellas were folded. Someone laughed when the last drops fell from an eave after the rain itself had stopped. Seibei closed the workshop early. They walked toward the district beyond the canal, following other residents drawn by the clearing sky. The streets smelled newly washed. Water ran along the gutters, carrying leaves and scraps of festival paper. From open kitchens came the scent of soy, grilled river fish, and sweet rice. Near the shrine, bamboo branches stood decorated with wishes. Lanterns were being raised along the road. Hana recognized them before they were lit. The peony hung near a food stall. The iris marked the entrance to the shrine grounds. Morning glory and wisteria swayed above a row of games for children. Her little yellow flowers had been placed beside the bridge where the road crossed a narrow canal. One by one, flames appeared inside them. Color deepened across the paper. Blue petals floated above amber light. Green leaves became dark silhouettes. The lotus glowed beside the shrine basin, while the chrysanthemum turned slowly in the damp evening breeze. Hana stood beneath her lantern. People crossed the bridge without knowing who had painted it. Some did not look upward. Others glanced briefly before continuing into the festival. An old woman paused, studied the tiny yellow flowers, and smiled as though she recognized them. The clouds thinned further. Far above Edo, 2 stars became visible on opposite sides of the pale band of the Milky Way. The city's people looked toward them, and remembered the ancient lovers divided by the celestial river. Whether the stars truly seemed closer on that night mattered less than the act of looking. Hana lifted her face to the clearing sky. Below, the canal carried the reflections of 20 flower lanterns, stretching their colors into wavering lines whenever the water moved. The festival continued until the moon rose above the eastern roofs. By then, the road near the shrine had grown warm with lantern light and crowded footsteps. Children carried paper ornaments on sticks. Vendors turned skewers over charcoal braziers, sending fragrant smoke into the damp air. Somewhere behind the shrine buildings, a flute played a slow melody while small drums kept time, their sound softened by distance and by the leaves still wet from rain. Hana remained beside the canal longer than Seibei expected. She watched the reflections of the lanterns tremble below the bridge. Each image stretched and broke whenever a breeze disturbed the water. The flowers she knew so well became unfamiliar there. The peony widened into red ripples. The iris divided into blue fragments. Her yellow blossoms appeared and disappeared between shadows cast by passing people. At last, Oharu touched her shoulder. "We should see the others before the candles burn low." They followed the line of lanterns toward the shrine. Hana counted them silently, making sure all 20 had been hung. One had been turned so that its flower faced a wall, and she resisted the urge to correct it. Another hung slightly crooked above a dumpling stall. Yet together they seemed less like separate pieces of work than a single glowing garden spread through the neighborhood. Near the shrine gate, strips of wish paper rustled from bamboo branches. Some had begun to curl after the rain. Others were fresh and dry, written only that evening. The characters ranged from careful to hurried, bold to faint. Most would never be read by anyone except the person who had tied them there. Seibei stood before the lantern painted with a lotus. Its broad leaves filled the lower half of the paper, while the flower rose above them in pale pink strokes. He had painted it from memory, though he had spent one morning studying the carved blossoms at a temple basin. "A little too upright," he said. Oharu looked at him. "Only you would notice. That does not mean it is not so." Hana smiled. Seibei could accept payment, praise, and even admiration without changing expression, but a line that leaned wrongly would trouble him for days. They purchased 3 small cakes made from rice flour and sweet bean paste. Hana ate hers slowly while they walked among stalls selling fans, toys, combs, and inexpensive charms. A man demonstrated folded paper figures that opened when placed on water. Nearby, children tried to scoop floating toys from a basin with fragile paper nets. The city around them seemed entirely awake. Yet, beyond the festival streets, Edo remained dark and ordinary. Servants carried late meals. Boatmen guided cargo through the canals. Night watchmen prepared their clappers. In distant workshops, artisans continued working by lamplight. The celebration occupied only a few bright roads in an immense city. When they finally turned homeward, the stars were still visible. Clouds had withdrawn toward the horizon, leaving the sky washed and clear. Hana searched for the weaver maiden and the herdsman, though she was uncertain which lights they were. Seibei pointed out 2 stars separated by the faint white river overhead, but he admitted that city haze made the heavenly pattern difficult to see. "Do they meet before dawn?" Hana asked. "In the story, they meet tonight." "And then separate again?" "Yes." She considered the sadness of this, though the festival itself had not felt sad. Perhaps people preferred the meeting to the separation. Perhaps one clear night mattered because it was brief. At the Nagaya gate, they found the neighborhood bamboo still standing beside the well. Its decorations had survived the rain badly. Several paper strips drooped against the stem, and one folded crane had lost a wing. Seibei's wish remained tied in place. Hana tried to read it as she passed, but he had folded the paper inward. Inside, the workshop held the stale warmth of a room closed through the evening. Oharu opened the upper shutter while Seibei relit the brazier. Hana climbed to the loft, but sleep did not come immediately. Through the thin wall she heard the sandal maker returning home. A bucket moved near the well. Far away, a final drumbeat carried from the shrine and faded. She imagined the candles inside the flower lanterns shrinking lower. One by one, the designs would dim. The merchant's assistants would extinguish them, fold the frames, and store them until another evening. Yet for a few hours they had changed the street. They had made flowers bloom after dark. The next morning brought heat. The rain-washed coolness vanished beneath a bright sun, and steam seemed to rise from every roof and board. By midday, the lane smelled of wet timber warming, cooked rice, and the faint sourness of drains. Cicadas began their steady calling from trees beyond the houses. Summer settled over Edo with weight. People adjusted their routines. Work began earlier, while morning air still moved through the lanes. At noon, shutters were angled against the sun. Water was sprinkled before doorways to lay the dust and suggest coolness. Cotton robes became lighter, sleeves looser, meals simpler. Seibei suffered in the heat. Paste spoiled quickly if neglected, paper softened in damp air, and perspiration made delicate work dangerous. He tied a cloth around his forehead and kept another beside him for his hands. Even so, he sometimes paused over a lantern until a drop of sweat had safely passed. Hana fanned the drying frames. The summer order had brought new customers. A restaurant requested lanterns painted with river fish. A boat owner wanted his family crest renewed. Genshichi sent word that 2 of the tea shop lanterns had been damaged during a crowded evening near the bridge. There was enough work to keep the household secure, but never enough space. Frames hung from beams. Paper rolls occupied the driest shelf. Bowls of pigment stood beneath cloth covers. Oharu's sewing had been pushed nearer to the doorway, where she complained that passing neighbors could see every crooked stitch. One afternoon, when the heat had made even the insects quiet, Hana carried a repaired lantern to Genshichi's shop. The streets shimmered beneath the sun. porters rested in strips of shade. Dogs slept beneath carts. Along the canal, boatmen covered their heads with cloth and moved slowly at their poles. At Ryogoku, the river offered a little breeze. Genshichi's shop was nearly empty. He sat near the entrance with a fan, watching the street as though waiting for it to recover from the afternoon. "You brought the repair," he said. Hana bowed and placed the wrapped lantern before him. He inspected the new panel, then pointed toward the row beneath the eaves. Her plum lantern was gone. Hana looked along the hooks once more, thinking she had missed it. "The frame split last night," Genshichi said. "A drunken customer struck it with his shoulder. I kept the painted paper." From beneath the counter, he brought out the damaged lantern. One side had collapsed. The bamboo ribs were broken in 2 places, and the paper had torn through Seibei's lettering. Hana's plum branch, however, remained almost untouched. She held the lantern carefully. "It can be repaired," she said. Genshichi shook his head. "Your uncle will say a new frame is wiser." Hana knew that he was probably right. Outside, sunlight flashed upon the river. The painted blossoms lay across her hands, preserved from spring though summer now pressed hot and bright against the city. She wrapped the broken lantern again. "I will ask him," she said. Seibei received the broken lantern without surprise. He turned it slowly in his hands, examining the split ribs, the torn lettering, and the surviving branch of plum blossoms. Afternoon heat filled the workshop. Beyond the open shutter, cicadas sang with such force that the lane itself seemed to vibrate. "Genshichi was correct," he said. "A new frame would be wiser." Hana knelt opposite him. "But the painted side is sound." "So was the sparrow on the sweet shop lantern." "And you preserved that?" Seibei looked at her. The old sparrow had belonged to a dead craftsman, and to the woman who had kept his work through many seasons. Hana's plum branch was scarcely a few months old. Yet he understood that age alone did not decide what people wished to save. "The frame broke across the name," he said. "If we replace it, the new lantern will not fold in quite the same way." "It does not need to be exactly the same." "No." He set the damaged piece on the table. "We will remove the painted panel first." The work was slower than Hana expected. Paste that had once fastened paper firmly to bamboo now had to be softened without staining the ink. Seibei laid a damp cloth over the inner surface, waited, lifted one edge, and waited again. The room grew still around the task. Oharu watched from the doorway, fanning herself. "A great deal of trouble for one crooked branch," she said. Hana glanced at her mother. Oharu smiled. "A pleasant crooked branch." When the panel finally came free, it was placed between clean sheets of paper and weighted flat beneath a smooth board. Seibei discarded the ruined frame, though Hana noticed that he saved 2 unbroken bamboo rings for future repairs. For the replacement, he chose a slightly smaller form. The old panel could not cover a lantern of equal size without adding awkward seams, so he designed one in which the plum branch occupied a broad central section. New paper would surround it, and the tea shop's name would be repainted on the reverse. Hana helped bind the ribs. The cicadas continued their relentless chorus. Heat gathered beneath the roof and settled across their shoulders. From time to time, Oharu sprinkled water outside the entrance. The scent of wet boards rose briefly, offering the illusion of coolness. By evening, the new frame was complete. Seibei lifted the flattened panel and held it against the bamboo. The branch fit with only a narrow margin. One blossom had to be trimmed at its outer edge, a small sacrifice Hana accepted after studying it for some time. She pasted the paper herself. Her fingers trembled at first, but the old panel settled smoothly over the new frame. Seibei added fresh paper around it, matching the earlier color with a wash of weak tea. The result did not conceal the repair. Under close inspection, the border between old and new remained visible. "It looks mended," Hana said. "It is mended." She waited for him to say more. A repair need not pretend that nothing happened, he added. They left the lantern to dry through the night. Summer evenings had changed the Nagaya. Neighbors remained outside long after sunset, seeking any breeze that entered the lane. Children chased insects near the gate. Someone placed a low stool beside the well and told a story in a voice too soft for Hana to follow. Mosquito coils smoldered near open doors, sending bitter smoke into the warm air. Hana sat on the threshold with a fan. Above the roofs, the sky was deep and clear. No moon had yet risen, but stars showed faintly through the city haze. Somewhere beyond the houses, a flute played a wandering tune, pausing so often that each new phrase seemed to come from a different street. Seibei joined her after checking the drying lantern. "Will Genshichi keep it inside now?" Hana asked. "He ordered it for his doorway. It may break again." "Most useful things do." She moved the fan slowly. "Then people repair them. Sometimes. And sometimes they replace them." "Yes." Hana considered the answer. It seemed less certain than she wished, but perhaps certainty was not what Seibei intended to give her. The next morning they carried the lantern to Ryogoku together. Edo was already awake beneath the summer sun. Fish sellers had packed their remaining goods with wet leaves. Water carriers moved between households. Men unloading boats worked bare-chested near the river, their skin shining as they lifted baskets from deck to quay. Along the bridge approach, stalls had opened early to catch travelers before the worst heat. Vendors sold chilled melon, noodles, fans, and cups of water flavored faintly with barley. Genshichi's tea shop had raised all its shutters, but the interior remained shadowed and cool. He examined the repaired lantern in silence. The preserved plum branch appeared darker against the new paper. Seibei's fresh lettering was stronger than the old, and the smaller shape gave the design a different balance. "It is not the same lantern," Genshichi said. "No," Seibei replied. The tea shop owner turned it toward the doorway, where sunlight passed through the paper. "But it remembers the first one." He paid for the repair and sent an assistant to hang it nearest the entrance once again. Hana stepped outside to watch. The lantern looked modest beside the larger signs. Its paper bore a faint line where old met new. Yet when the breeze from the river turned it, the plum blossoms passed in and out of the light as if they had been painted that morning. Genshichi brought them cold tea. "Come back after sunset," he said. "The boats will be out for the river cooling." That evening they returned with Oharu. The heat remained in the streets, but along the Sumida the air moved freely. Pleasure boats drifted across the dark water, their roofs outlined by lanterns. Some carried musicians. Others held families or groups of merchants eating supper beneath the open sky. Laughter traveled strangely over the river, clear for a moment and then gone. Stalls crowded the bank. Grilled eel, roasted corn, and sweet dumplings scented the warm night. Children held small fans painted with goldfish. Men loosened their robes at the neck and watched the boats pass beneath Ryogoku Bridge. Genshichi's lanterns glowed above the tea shop. Hana's repaired plum branch shone among them, a flower of late winter surviving in the heart of summer. Most people passed without noticing. A few looked up. One elderly man stopped beneath it and studied the seam in the paper. "Old work?" he asked Genshichi. "Old and new," the tea shop owner replied. The man nodded as though this answer suited him and entered. Hana stood near the river railing. Below, lantern reflections stretched across the black water in wavering bands of red, gold, and white. Far downstream, a boat turned slowly, carrying its lights toward the darkness beyond the bridge. Then, from somewhere along the bank, a deep drum sounded. Another answered from across the river. People lifted their faces toward the sky, where the first firework of summer rose unseen through the darkness before opening above Edo in a quiet sphere of silver light. Seibei received the broken lantern without surprise. He turned it slowly in his hands, examining the split ribs, the torn lettering, and the surviving branch of plum blossoms. Afternoon heat filled the workshop. Beyond the open shutter, cicadas sang with such force that the lane itself seemed to vibrate. Genshichi was correct, he said. A new frame would be wiser. Hana knelt opposite him, but the painted side is sound. So was the sparrow on the sweet shop lantern. And you preserved that. Seibei looked at her. The old sparrow had belonged to a dead craftsman, and to the woman who had kept his work through many seasons. Hana's plum branch was scarcely a few months old, yet he understood that age alone did not decide what people wished to save. The frame broke across the name, he said. If we replace it, the new lantern will not fold in quite the same way. It does not need to be exactly the same. No. He set the damaged piece on the table. We will remove the painted panel first. The work was slower than Hana expected. Paste that had once fastened paper firmly to bamboo now had to be softened without staining the ink. Seibei laid a damp cloth over the inner surface, waited, lifted one edge, and waited again. The room grew still around the task. Oharu watched from the doorway, fanning herself. A great deal of trouble for one crooked branch, she said. Hana glanced at her mother. Oharu smiled. A pleasant, crooked branch. When the panel finally came free, it was placed between clean sheets of paper and weighted flat beneath a smooth board. Seibei discarded the ruined frame, though Hana noticed that he saved 2 unbroken bamboo rings for future repairs. For the replacement, he chose a slightly smaller form. The old panel could not cover a lantern of equal size without adding awkward seams, so he designed one in which the plum branch occupied a broad central section. New paper would surround it, and the tea shop's name would be repainted on the reverse. Hana helped bind the ribs. The cicadas continued their relentless chorus. Heat gathered beneath the roof and settled across their shoulders. From time to time, Oharu sprinkled water outside the entrance. The scent of wet boards rose briefly, offering the illusion of coolness. By evening, the new frame was complete. Seibei lifted the flattened panel and held it against the bamboo. The branch fit with only a narrow margin. One blossom had to be trimmed at its outer edge, a small sacrifice Hana accepted after studying it for some time. She pasted the paper herself. Her fingers trembled at first, but the old panel settled smoothly over the new frame. Seibei added fresh paper around it, matching the earlier color with a wash of weak tea. The result did not conceal the repair. Under close inspection, the border between old and new remained visible. It looks mended, Hana said. It is mended. She waited for him to say more. A repair need not pretend that nothing happened, he added. They left the lantern to dry through the night. Summer evenings had changed the Nagaya. Neighbors remained outside long after sunset, seeking any breeze that entered the lane. Children chased insects near the gate. Someone placed a low stool beside the well and told a story in a voice too soft for Hana to follow. Mosquito coils smoldered near open doors, sending bitter smoke into the warm air. Hana sat on the threshold with a fan. Above the roofs, the sky was deep and clear. No moon had yet risen, but stars showed faintly through the city haze. Somewhere beyond the houses, a flute played a wandering tune, pausing so often that each new phrase seemed to come from a different street. Seibei joined her after checking the drying lantern. "Will Genshichi keep it inside now?" Hana asked. "He ordered it for his doorway." "It may break again." "Most useful things do." She moved the fan slowly. "Then people repair them." "Sometimes." "And sometimes they replace them." "Yes." Hana considered the answer. It seemed less certain than she wished, but perhaps certainty was not what Seibei intended to give her. The next morning, they carried the lantern to Ryogoku together. Edo was already awake beneath the summer sun. Fish sellers had packed their remaining goods with wet leaves. Water carriers moved between households. Men unloading boats worked bare-chested near the river, their skin shining as they lifted baskets from deck to quay. Along the bridge approach, stalls had opened early to catch travelers before the worst heat. Vendors sold chilled melon, noodles, fans, and cups of water flavored faintly with barley. Genshichi's tea shop had raised all its shutters, but the interior remained shadowed and cool. He examined the repaired lantern in silence. The preserved plum branch appeared darker against the new paper. Seibei's fresh lettering was stronger than the old, and the smaller shape gave the design a different balance. "It is not the same lantern," Genshichi said. "No," Seibei replied. The tea shop owner turned it toward the doorway, where sunlight passed through the paper. "But it remembers the first one." He paid for the repair and sent an assistant to hang it nearest the entrance once again. Hana stepped outside to watch. The lantern looked modest beside the larger signs. Its paper bore a faint line where old met new. Yet when the breeze from the river turned it, the plum blossoms passed in and out of the light as if they had been painted that morning. Genshichi brought them cold tea. "Come back after sunset," he said. "The boats will be out for the river cooling." That evening they returned with Oharu. The heat remained in the streets, but along the Sumida the air moved freely. Pleasure boats drifted across the dark water, their roofs outlined by lanterns. Some carried musicians. Others held families or groups of merchants eating supper beneath the open sky. Laughter traveled strangely over the river, clear for a moment and then gone. Stalls crowded the bank. Grilled eel, roasted corn, and sweet dumplings scented the warm night. Children held small fans painted with goldfish. Men loosened their robes at the neck and watched the boats pass beneath Ryogoku Bridge. Genshichi's lanterns glowed above the tea shop. Hana's repaired plum branch shone among them, a flower of late winter surviving in the heart of summer. Most people passed without noticing. A few looked up. One elderly man stopped beneath it and studied the seam in the paper. "Old work?" he asked Genshichi. "Old and new," the tea shop owner replied. The man nodded, as though this answer suited him, and entered. Hana stood near the river railing. Below, lantern reflections stretched across the black water in wavering bands of red, gold, and white. Far downstream, a boat turned slowly, carrying its lights toward the darkness beyond the bridge. Then, from somewhere along the bank, a deep drum sounded. Another answered from across the river. People lifted their faces toward the sky, where the first firework of summer rose unseen through the darkness before opening above Edo in a quiet sphere of silver light. The paper lay across the work table, pale and empty beneath the afternoon light. Seibei selected one of the folding frames used for small festival lanterns. When closed, its bamboo spiral rested almost flat. When lifted, the frame lengthened into a narrow oval, each rib rising farther from the one below. He opened and closed it several times while Hana held the blue wave fan nearby. "The folds are not equal," he said. "They do not need to be. They do if the pattern must meet." Hana watched the bamboo turn. A painted line placed carelessly across the paper might break when the lantern opened, leaving sparks that pointed in different directions. The design would have to account for the hidden movement of the frame. Seibei measured the distance between the ribs with a paper strip. Then he marked faint guides in charcoal, so light that they nearly disappeared unless viewed from an angle. They began with a plain sheet rather than fine lantern paper. Hana painted a dark circle at its center, leaving the middle untouched. Around it she placed small points and curved strokes, following the sketch Seibei had made after the fireworks. He added longer lines descending from the outer edge, each narrowing as it fell. When the paint dried, they pasted the sheet to the frame. Closed, the pattern looked crowded and uncertain. The sparks overlapped, and the central space seemed too small. Hana's face fell. "Open it," Seibei said. She lifted the upper ring slowly. The bamboo spiral rose. Paper stretched between the ribs, and the design separated. The dark circle widened. Painted sparks moved apart from one another, while the longer lines appeared to descend in gentle arcs. It did not resemble a firework exactly, but it carried something of the moment when light opened above the Sumida. Oharu came from the doorway to inspect it. "It resembles a dandelion losing its seeds," she said. Hana closed her eyes briefly. Seibei turned the lantern once. "She is not entirely wrong." They tried again. On the second sheet, the center remained smaller, and the outer lines were stronger. Seibei painted some strokes across the expected folds, so they would divide cleanly when opened. Hana placed scattered points farther from the circle, remembering how the sparks had seemed to wander into the darkness after the brightest light had faded. The second lantern looked less like a flower. When illuminated at dusk, it looked more convincing still. Seibei placed a small candle inside and lowered the shutters. The workshop darkened around them. Light passed through the unpainted center first, forming a quiet brightness surrounded by broken lines. As Hana opened the frame, the sparks spread across the paper. For a moment, the lantern seemed to change while remaining still. Oharu regarded it from the other side of the room. That one would sell. Seibei extinguished the candle. To whom? A person who saw the fireworks. And to one who did not, Hana added. The experimental lantern joined the others hanging from the beam, though it had no customer and no stated purpose. During the following days, several visitors noticed it. A restaurant servant asked whether it represented a chrysanthemum. A young clerk guessed that it showed rain falling around the moon. One child declared it a startled sea creature. No one called it a firework until Genshichi came to collect 2 repaired lanterns. He entered in the late morning, carrying the smell of river air and roasted tea. His summer robe was damp at the collar, and he accepted a cup of water before discussing business. Then he saw the lantern above the work table. "You have put the Sumida sky on paper," he said. Hana looked at Seibei in triumph. Genshichi asked to see it lit. Though the room was bright, Seibei placed a candle inside and opened the frame. The tea shop owner watched the pattern widen. "I will take 4, he said. Seibei shook his head. "This is only a trial." "Then make 4 trials. They will not be identical." "Better?" Genshichi wanted them for the river viewing evenings that continued through late summer. Customers would sit near the entrance, drink tea, and remember the great display even after the fireworks themselves had ended. The order brought new difficulties. One successful experiment did not guarantee another. The paper absorbed pigment differently in humid weather. A pattern that opened well on one frame appeared uneven on the next. Seibei adjusted each design by hand, refusing to trace the first one exactly. Hana painted the scattered sparks. She found that irregularity made them more natural. When she placed the points too evenly, the lantern looked like patterned cloth. When she allowed small spaces and clusters, the darkness seemed to enter between them. The 4 lanterns were completed near the end of the hottest month. Genshichi hung 2 outside his shop and 2 within, where their light reflected faintly in polished wooden trays. People began calling them firework lanterns, though each showed only the fading edge of a burst, not its brilliant beginning. By then, summer itself had begun to fade. The change was almost invisible at first. Dawn arrived a little later. Cicadas still cried from the trees, but their chorus no longer lasted without pause. In the evening, a different insect sang from beneath walls and grasses, producing a thinner, cooler sound. The wind shifted. It moved through the Nagaya gate after sunset, carrying less of the day's heat. Neighbors who had slept near open shutters reached for light robes before morning. Oharu brought the padded quilts down from storage and spread them in the sun to air, though winter remained far away. Hana noticed the sky most of all. Summer clouds had risen white and immense beyond the roofs. Now the heavens seemed clearer, their blue deeper, their distant edges sharpened. At twilight, the western light lingered in narrow bands of peach and violet. Dragonflies appeared above the canal, turning so quickly that their wings flashed and vanished. One evening, Seibei sent Hana to deliver the final firework lantern to the tea shop. She walked toward Ryogoku beneath a sky already touched by early autumn. Shopkeepers were lighting their signs. Cooking smoke hung low in the lanes. From an open house came the sound of someone practicing a song on the shamisen, slower and more confident than the musician Hana had heard in spring. At Genshichi's doorway, the repaired plum lantern still hung nearest the street. Beside it glowed one of the new firework designs. Winter plum and summer fire shared the same eve, their seasons held together by paper, bamboo, and candlelight. The little seam on the repaired lantern remained visible. The firework lantern opened wider in the evening breeze, scattering its painted sparks. Genshichi accepted the delivery and gave Hana a cup of cool barley tea. "Your uncle says this is the last one," he said. "For now." "Does he plan another design?" Hana thought of all the things the year had already offered them. Plum branches, cherry petals, rainy season flowers, stars divided by a heavenly river, fireworks reflected in dark water. "Autumn has not arrived yet," she said. But on the walk home, she heard the bell crickets singing beneath the bridge, and the air smelled faintly of dry grass. Above Edo, the first clear autumn moon was beginning to rise. The moon rose slowly, clearing the tiled roofs with a pale edge before revealing its full, round face. Hana paused beside the canal to watch it. The water below was darker than the sky, yet the reflection appeared there almost at once, broken into long silver pieces by the wake of a passing boat. Bell crickets sang beneath the bridge. Their delicate notes seemed to come from the stones themselves. She had heard people speak of the autumn moon as though it were different from every other moon. Now, standing in the cooler air, she understood a little of what they meant. Summer's moon had often appeared through heat and smoke, distant above restless streets. This one seemed nearer and clearer, shining over roof ridges, laundry poles, warehouse walls, and the quiet surface of the canal with equal calm. At home, Oharu had already placed a small tray near the open shutter. On it stood round rice dumplings, a cup of tea, and several stems of Suzuki grass gathered from an open patch near the city's edge. Their feathery heads caught the moonlight whenever the breeze moved them. "For viewing," Oharu said when Hana entered. Seibei was sitting beside the work table, inspecting a frame by lamplight. He glanced toward the tray, and afterward for eating. "Not until the moon has admired them," Oharu replied. The three sat near the shutter after supper. From their narrow room, the moon was visible only within a small square of sky between neighboring roofs. Every few moments it vanished behind the eaves as they shifted position, then appeared again when they leaned closer to the opening. Elsewhere in Edo, people viewed it from gardens, bridges, temple grounds, boats, and upper rooms. Poets composed verses. Merchants poured sake for guests. Children waited impatiently for the dumplings set aside as offerings. Yet in the Nagaya the observance remained quiet. Hana watched the pale heads of grass tremble. "What flower belongs to the moon?" she asked. "Pampas grass, perhaps," Oharu said. "That is not a flower. It is close enough when arranged properly." Seibei looked at the silver light on the tray. "The moon needs no flower." Hana knew from his tone that he was thinking of a lantern. The next morning the city seemed newly sharpened. Shadows lay clearly beneath the eaves. Roof tiles, faded curtains, Wooden signs and passing faces all appeared more distinct beneath the autumn sun. The heat had not disappeared, but it no longer pressed into every room. Work became easier. Paste dried predictably. Paper held its shape. Seibei could keep the shutters open without inviting the heavy dampness of the rainy season. He accepted several orders for the coming months. Lanterns for a harvest celebration, replacements for a temple approach, and 2 large signs for a dealer in dried seaweed. Hana's hands had grown steadier. She could now bind simple frames without supervision and paste paper over small lanterns without leaving wrinkles near the base. Seibei still inspected everything, but his corrections became fewer. Sometimes he placed a finished piece among his own work without saying who had made it. Oharu noticed even when customers did not. One afternoon, a traveling seller arrived carrying a bundle of damaged lanterns. He moved through villages and small towns outside Edo, selling needles, combs, medicine, paper, and household objects from boxes balanced on a pole. His lanterns had endured rain, dust, and long roads. One bore the name of an inn near a post station. Another showed a faded pine tree. The smallest was marked with a simple circle. "I need only 2 repaired," he said. "The others may be used for parts." Seibei examined the pile. Hana knelt beside him. The lantern with the pine tree was crushed beyond easy repair, but much of its painted paper remained. Its branches had been made with quick, rough strokes, unlike Seibei's careful lines. "Where has this one traveled?" she asked. The seller rubbed his chin. "Along the Tokaido as far as Odawara, perhaps farther. It belonged to another man before me." Hana imagined the lantern swinging beside roads she had never seen, past fields, rivers, villages, and travelers approaching from distant provinces. It might have glowed outside roadside lodgings, or guided its owner beneath rain-darkened pines. Seibei chose 2 frames that could be restored cheaply. From the others he saved usable bamboo rings, metal fittings, and patches of plain paper. The painted pine remained on the table. "Parts," Seibei said. Hana touched the dry paper. "Could we keep this part?" For what? She did not know. The pine was not beautiful in the polished way of a print or painted screen. Its trunk leaned heavily to one side. 3 branches reached outward like stiff fingers. Yet it carried the marks of weather and travel, soot near the top and a faint brown stain along the base. Seibei looked at it for some time. Then he cut around the painted section and placed it flat beneath a board. "For practice," he said. The seller departed the following day with his 2 repaired lanterns and several coins still in his purse. The remaining frames were dismantled. Bamboo that had once formed roadside lights became rings, braces, and narrow strips for new work. Hana kept thinking about the painted pine. In Edo, objects rarely remained themselves forever. Cloth was patched, unpicked, and sewn into smaller garments. Broken ceramics were mended or used as containers. Ash, paper, wax, metal, and even human waste could be collected, sold, and given another purpose. The city consumed endlessly, yet it also gathered what had been used and sent it back into circulation. A lantern might become 3 lanterns. That thought pleased her. As autumn deepened, carts and boats brought seasonal goods into the city. Chestnuts appeared in market baskets. Persimmons ripened from green to orange. Mushrooms were laid out on woven trays. Vendors roasted sweet potatoes again, and their warm scent returned to the streets after the long summer absence. The air became lively with preparation. Neighborhoods planned festivals. Temples announced observances. Cloth sellers displayed heavier cotton. Households inspected screens and shutters before the colder months. Farmers from beyond Edo arrived with vegetables still carrying field soil around their roots. One morning, Seibei sent Hana with Oharu to a market near the river. They walked beneath a high blue sky. Stalls overflowed with daikon, burdock root, Taro, beans, greens, and red peppers strung beneath awnings. Fish lay bright on beds of wet leaves. Bundles of firewood rose beside charcoal sacks. A knife sharpener worked at a turning stone, the wet blade making a soft, regular hiss. Oharu bargained over chestnuts while Hana wandered toward a stall selling old household goods. There were bowls with chipped rims, worn tobacco pipes, cracked trays, lamp fittings, bits of cloth, and paper umbrellas needing new covers. Near the back stood a small folding lantern with no paper left upon its frame. Hana lifted it. The bamboo was dark from age but sound. When opened, the ribs formed a nearly perfect circle rather than an oval. "How much?" she asked. Oharu turned from the chestnut seller. "For that skeleton?" The stall-keeper named a price low enough to be tempting and high enough to require bargaining. Oharu objected to the missing paper, the worn top ring, and a stain whose existence Hana could not see. After a patient exchange, the lantern became theirs. They carried it home with the vegetables. Seibei opened the old frame and tested each rib. "It may hold," he said. Hana brought out the preserved pine panel from beneath the board. The shape was not large enough to cover the frame. It could occupy only one side, leaving the rest for new paper. She placed it against the circle and imagined the rough tree standing beneath a broad, empty sky. "Moonlight," she said. Seibei looked toward the open shutter, where the afternoon sun lay across the floor. Together they began planning a lantern made from a traveler's pine, a market frame, fresh paper, and the memory of an autumn moon rising over Edo. The old frame opened with a faint creak. Its bamboo ribs had darkened through years of smoke and handling. Yet the circle remained true. Seibei ran his thumb along each joint, testing for hidden weakness. One narrow strip had begun to split near the lower ring. He bound it with fine thread and brushed the repair with paste, leaving the frame beside the brazier until morning. Hana kept the painted pine beneath a clean sheet of paper. She had begun to think of it not as a picture, but as a traveler. Its rough branches had passed beneath rain, rested in roadside inns, and perhaps swung beside a man walking through dusk along the Tokaido. Now it had come to their workshop, where the sounds outside were those of the familiar Nagaya well and the vendors moving toward Nihonbashi. The following day, Seibei measured the preserved panel against the circular frame. The pine occupied less than half the lantern. Around it, fresh paper would form a pale field. Hana wanted to paint the autumn moon above the tree, but Seibei shook his head. "A painted moon may look like a white plate. Then we could leave a circle unpainted. The whole paper is unpainted." She considered this difficulty while Oharu peeled boiled chestnuts nearby. Their shells cracked softly beneath her knife, and a warm, earthy sweetness filled the room. "What if the moon were brighter than the rest?" Hana asked. Seibei held the new paper toward the window. Lantern makers could create differences in brightness by thinning paper, layering it, staining it, or leaving openings covered by more translucent sheets. Each method carried risk. Paper made too thin would tear. Too many layers would appear dull. He selected a small round of fine paper, lighter than the sheets used for ordinary shop lanterns. "We place this behind an opening," he said, "not above it." Hana watched as he cut a circle from the main panel and pasted the finer paper across it from within. When the lantern was unlit, the moon appeared only as a slight change in texture. Light would reveal it. The preserved pine required more patience. Its old paper had become brittle, especially along the stained lower edge. Seibei softened it gradually and attached it to a backing sheet before fitting it to the frame. He did not trim away the darkened marks. They remained beneath the trunk like roadside earth. Hana pasted the surrounding panels. Fresh paper met old paper in visible seams. The dark bamboo showed faintly beneath both. At the upper edge, the translucent moon waited above the leaning tree. When the lantern had dried, They closed the shutters and lit a candle inside. The room gathered around its glow. At first, Hana saw only the moon, a quiet circle brighter than the paper surrounding it. Then her eyes adjusted, and the pine emerged below, its branches crossing the pale field in rough black strokes. The stains and soot marks softened in the light. They looked less like damage than mist near the ground. Oharu placed the bowl of chestnuts aside. "That one belongs beside a road," she said. Hana turned the lantern slowly. From one angle, the old pine stood beneath the moon. From another, there was only new paper and warm light. "It has a front and a back," she said. "Most lanterns do," Seibei replied, "but the back is empty. It is resting." They did not offer the lantern for sale. Seibei hung it near the sleeping loft, where its candle was lit only on clear evenings. It gave less light than a practical household lamp, but enough to soften the workshop walls. The traveler's pine seemed to stand beyond the bamboo frames and paper rolls, rooted in some unseen landscape outside Edo. Autumn moved quietly through the city. Morning air sharpened. Shopkeepers rubbed their hands before opening shutters. The first breath of each day became faintly visible. Trees along temple grounds turned yellow and red, though many leaves in the crowded merchant districts simply browned, loosened, and collected in gutters. Hana began wearing an extra cotton layer beneath her robe. The neighborhood prepared for colder weather. Screens were patched. Charcoal was purchased and stored. Families aired padded bedding beneath the sun. The bathhouse grew busier in the evenings, when steam escaped its entrance and drifted into the dark street. For Seibei, autumn brought orders associated with travel. Merchants replaced lanterns before winter journeys. Inns repaired their signs. Pilgrims preparing to leave Edo wanted small folding lights that could be carried easily along the roads. Some customers requested names or crests. Others preferred plain paper, easier to replace in unfamiliar towns. One morning, a young man arrived with a travel lantern wrapped in cloth. He wore the plain clothing of a clerk and carried himself with the uncertain seriousness of someone about to undertake his first long journey. His employer was sending him west with letters and accounts. He expected to travel as far as Kyoto, though the route and weather might delay him. The lantern was new but poorly made. Its upper ring slipped, and the paper had already loosened. "My mother bought it," he explained. "She says I must not begin a journey with a damaged light." Seibei repaired the ring while Hana prepared a fresh strip of paper. "Will you walk the whole road?" she asked. "Most of it." "Past Odawara?" The clerk smiled. "Long past Odawara." Hana thought of the pine panel and the roads it might have known. "Will you see Mount Fuji?" "If the clouds permit." Seibei glanced at her, reminding her without words that a customer had not come to answer endless questions. The clerk requested one small mark on the lantern so he would recognize it easily among those at inns. He had no family crest he wished to use and did not want his employer's name displayed. Hana expected Seibei to paint a simple circle. Instead, he asked, "What will you remember from home?" The young man looked toward the lane. For several moments he seemed unable to choose among all the ordinary things he was about to leave. His household, familiar streets, the taste of local food, the temple bell heard each morning. "At our gate," he said at last, "there is a ginkgo tree." Seibei painted one small fan-shaped leaf near the base of the lantern. The clerk watched the yellow pigment dry. "It looks exactly like those falling now," he said. "No leaf falls exactly like another," Hana replied. Seibei's expression suggested that she had heard him say something similar too many times. The young man paid and wrapped the lantern carefully. Before leaving, he bowed to the workshop, not merely to Seibei, as though thanking the room itself for making his journey feel more possible. Hana followed him to the gate. He disappeared into the morning traffic, carrying the folded lantern beneath one arm. Soon he would cross Nihonbashi and travel beyond the edges of the city, past fields already cut for harvest, post towns, rivers, hills, and long stretches of road beneath the autumn sky. When Hana returned, the traveler's pine lantern still hung unlit above the work table. That evening, Seibei placed a candle inside it. The moon appeared first, then the old tree below. Outside, dry leaves scraped gently along the lane. Somewhere near the gate, a neighbor was roasting sweet potatoes, and their warm scent entered through the shutter. Oharu sewed beside the brazier. Hana sorted bamboo strips into bundles. No one spoke for a while. The lantern's light remained steady, holding a distant road within their narrow room as autumn settled more deeply over Edo. The first cold rain came before dawn. It tapped lightly against the roof tiles, too soft to wake the entire Nagaya, but steady enough that Seibei opened his eyes and listened. Beneath the quilt, the room was still warm with sleep. The brazier had gone dark. From the loft came Hana's quiet breathing, and beside the wall the traveler's pine lantern hung without a candle, its old branches invisible in the grayness. By morning the rain had strengthened. Water streamed from the eaves and gathered in the lane, carrying yellow leaves toward the gate. The ginkgo trees beyond the neighborhood had begun shedding in earnest. Their fan-shaped leaves, bright only days before, now lay flattened against bridges, temple steps, and the boards outside shops. Hana crouched near the threshold, watching one leaf circle in a puddle. She thought of the young clerk walking west with his lantern. Perhaps he had already reached a post town beyond Odawara. Perhaps rain had found him on an exposed road, and the small ginkgo mark now rested folded inside his pack. The journey seemed harder in cold weather than it had when he stood in the workshop. "He will have a straw cape," Oharu said, guessing her thoughts, "and dry sandals, for part of the day." Hana looked doubtful. "Travelers know how to be wet," Seibei said. "The skill is becoming dry again." He was repairing a large lantern belonging to a rice dealer. Its paper had sagged during damp weather, though the frame remained strong. The dealer wanted it ready before the year-end trade grew busy. Autumn had not finished, yet winter preparations had already entered Edo. Charcoal sellers moved through the streets with heavier loads. Households checked jars of pickles and dried vegetables. Merchants settled accounts and counted stock. Temple compounds swept leaves from their approaches each morning, only to find the stones covered again by afternoon. The city's clothing changed as well. Padded robes appeared beneath plain outer layers. Hoods and scarves framed faces in the early hours. Children tucked their hands inside their sleeves. At the bathhouse, people lingered longer in the hot water, reluctant to dress and step back into the cold street. Seibei welcomed the season's drier days when they came. Lantern paper tightened cleanly, paste behaved well, and the workshop no longer held summer's dampness. Yet shorter daylight required careful use of every hour. The shutters opened late and closed early. By evening they worked within the very light they made for others. One afternoon, Genchichi arrived carrying a basket. Inside were 2 roasted sweet potatoes, a packet of tea, and the repaired plum lantern. Hana looked from the basket to the lantern. "It is not broken," Genchichi said quickly. Seibei took it down from his hands. The paper was sooty near the top, and the frame had darkened for months beside the tea-shop entrance, but no rib had split. The old painted branch remained visible across the central panel. "Then why bring it?" Seibei asked. "I am replacing the row before the new year. This one has earned a quieter place." Genchichi wanted the lantern cleaned and fitted with a new candle holder. Afterward, he intended to hang it inside the shop, near the shelf where winter customers warmed themselves over tea. Hana ran one finger above the seam without touching it. The lantern had survived plum season, cherry season, summer rain, festival crowds, fireworks, and the first cold winds. It no longer looked new, but neither did it appear fragile. Seibei brushed away the soot with a soft cloth. "The paper may last another year," he said. Genshichi smiled. "Then perhaps it will remember too." While he waited, he accepted Oharu's tea and sat near the brazier. Outside, rainwater continued falling from the eaves, though the clouds had begun to lighten. "The river is quiet now," he said. "No pleasure boats, few evening crowds, only workers and people too cold to remain outdoors." "Your shop must be quiet as well," Oharu said. "Quiet people drink tea." He watched Hana polish the lantern's lower ring. "You should visit after the first snow." "Why?" she asked. "Ryogoku looks larger when the roofs are white." Seibei glanced toward the wet lane. "Snow may not come." "Then come after it does." By late afternoon, the rain ended. A clear strip of sky opened above the western roofs, pale and cold. Water continued dripping from every edge. The lane reflected the last light like dark lacquer. Genshichi departed with the plum lantern wrapped safely in cloth. After supper, Hana lit the traveler's pine lantern. The translucent moon brightened above the old branches, and the room settled into its familiar evening hush. Oharu mended a winter sleeve. Seibei sorted a bundle of bamboo, rejecting strips that had warped. Hana copied flower forms onto scraps, though spring seemed very distant now. Then a sound came from the lane. Not the watchman's clappers, nor a vendor's call, but the slow wooden knock of the gatekeeper announcing a visitor after dark. Seibei opened the shutter. A man stood beneath the eaves wearing a damp travel cloak. He was older than the young clerk and carried a long box wrapped in oiled cloth. Rain had darkened his sleeves, and road dust marked the hem of his robe despite the weather. "I was told," he said, bowing, "that a lantern maker named Seibei repairs old paper." Seibei opened the door wider. The traveler entered, bringing with him the scent of rain, straw, and distant roads. He placed the long box upon the work table and loosened its cords. Inside lay a folded lantern unlike any Hana had seen. Its frame was narrow and tall, with metal fittings greened by age. The paper was torn in several places, yet across it ran a painted landscape of mountains, boats, and a crescent moon. Near the lower edge, written in faded ink, was a date from many decades before Hana was born. Seibei leaned closer. Where did this come from? The traveler rested both hands upon the box. "From a storehouse in a post town west of Hakone," he said. "My family believes it once traveled to Edo with my grandfather." Outside, the wet leaves shifted in the cold wind. Within the workshop, the old lantern waited beneath the glow of the traveler's pine, carrying into their quiet room the first whisper of a journey made long ago. Seibei did not touch the old lantern at once. He lowered the traveler's pine light from its hook and placed it near the work table. The painted mountain landscape emerged more clearly, though time had softened every color. Blue slopes had faded toward gray. Boats rested upon a river, or perhaps a lake, their sails reduced to pale triangular shadows. Above them, the crescent moon was scarcely more than a curved brush stroke. The date near the lower edge had been written in a careful hand. Seibei read it silently, then counted backward. The lantern had been made nearly 60 years earlier, when he himself had not yet been born. Hana leaned close enough to see the fibers lifting from the torn paper. "Did it truly travel to Edo?" she asked. The visitor removed his damp outer cloak. His name was Jubei, and he kept an inn with his elder brother in a post town along the Tokaido, west of the Hakone barrier. Their family storehouse held objects no longer used but not quite forgotten. Account books, broken chests, old road equipment, bundles of letters, and several lantern frames blackened by smoke. "This one was inside its box," he said. "My grandfather rarely spoke of it. My father said it accompanied him when he was young." "Why bring it here now?" Oharu asked. Jubei looked toward the painted boats. The storehouse roof leaked during the last rains. We moved everything before the water reached it. My brother wished to throw the lantern away. But you did not, Hana said. No. He had found a folded sheet beneath the frame, containing a few lines written by his grandfather. The words mentioned Edo, the Nihonbashi Bridge, and a night spent viewing the Sumida under an autumn moon. There was no full account of the journey, only scattered impressions. Crowds at the fish market, the castle moats, lanterns along the river, and the astonishment of seeing so vast a city. Jubei had brought the note with him. Seibei accepted it carefully. The paper was brittle along its folds, and the ink had browned. He read the lines beneath the lamplight, while rainwater dripped from Jubei's travel hat near the door. Your grandfather may have bought the lantern here, Seibei said, or brought it from home. The frame is not unusual enough to tell us. Hana studied the crescent moon. Could the landscape be Hakone? Jubei smiled faintly. Or somewhere the painter imagined. The mountains rose steeply from the painted shore, but there was no landmark certain enough to name. A viewer could see Hakone, Lake Ashi, the hills beyond Odawara, or an invented place assembled from remembered roads and familiar brush patterns. Seibei examined the frame. The metal fittings were corroded but firm. Several bamboo ribs had snapped, and one side had warped inward, after years folded beneath uneven weight. The painted paper had survived only because the box had protected it from light and insects. It can be preserved, he said, but not restored to what it was. Jubei nodded. I did not expect that. A new frame may be placed behind the old paper. Some sections must be backed. The missing parts will remain missing unless new painting is added. No new landscape. Seibei looked at him. My grandfather saw what was there, Jubei continued. I would rather see what remains. The answer appeared to satisfy Seibei. Because the work would take several days, Jubei arranged to return after completing his business in Edo. He was delivering documents to a merchant and purchasing goods for the inn. Needles, medicines, fine paper, and several small luxuries difficult to obtain in the post town. Before leaving, he looked once more at the lantern. I had thought the city might have changed beyond recognition, he said. But Nihonbashi is still crowded, and the river still carries boats. Cities change while keeping their habits, Oharu replied. Jubei bowed and stepped into the cold lane. The gatekeeper guided him toward a nearby lodging house. Soon his footsteps faded, and only the dripping eaves remained. Seibei covered the old lantern with clean cloth. They did not begin that night. The next morning dawned clear and sharp. Rain had washed smoke from the sky, and sunlight fell brightly across the wet roofs. The lane steamed faintly where the light reached it. Seibei first recorded the lantern as it was. He measured every panel, joint, tear, and painted section. Hana copied the shape of the landscape onto thin paper, not to replace it but to remember the position of each surviving mark before the lantern was taken apart. Her brush moved slowly over the boats. There were 5 of them. 2 bore square sails. One appeared to be a ferry crowded with tiny figures. The remaining boats were little more than dark strokes upon the faded water. Do you think the painter saw them? She asked. Perhaps. Or copied them from another picture? Perhaps. Seibei's answers allowed the uncertainty to remain. He showed her how age altered what people believed they were seeing. A stain might resemble a tree. A torn edge could make a mountain appear steeper than it had been. A brush stroke meant as a wave could become, after decades, the shadow of a distant boat. By noon, the lantern had been carefully separated from its damaged inner frame. The paper relaxed when freed, revealing folds that had not opened for many years. Dust gathered beneath the lower ring. A tiny husk from an insect fell onto the table. The bamboo smelled dry and faintly smoky. One object had concealed many smaller histories: the hand that split the bamboo, the brush that painted the mountains, the candle soot from unknown nights, the crease made when someone folded it too hastily, the careful decision to place it in a box rather than discard it. Hana held one broken rib. This crossed Hakone? Possibly, Seibei said. She imagined the high road ascending through mist, travelers breathing hard beneath their loads, sandals slipping on wet stone, and inns appearing at dusk with lanterns glowing under their eaves. The old frame seemed too delicate for such a journey. Yet people carried delicate things across great distances every day. In the afternoon, Seibei began shaping a support frame from new bamboo. It would fit inside the surviving rings without forcing them outward. The old ribs that remained sound would rest against it, no longer required to bear the lantern's weight. Hana prepared backing paper. She used the thinnest paste possible, brushing it across the reverse of torn sections while Seibei held them flat. The work required long silences. Even Oharu set aside her noisier tasks and stitched near the doorway. As daylight faded, the landscape regained strength. Not brightness, for its colors remained muted, but steadiness. The mountains no longer sagged inward. The little boats rested once more upon level water. The crescent moon curved above them, faint yet distinct. They stopped before applying the final panel. Through the open shutter came the sounds of evening. Buckets at the well, a child reciting characters, the scrape of a broom, and the distant call of a noodle seller entering the lane. Seibei lit the traveler's pine lantern. Its round autumn moon shone over the old roadside tree. Beside it, upon the table, lay the unfinished landscape from a journey made decades before. Two painted roads, one imagined and one remembered, shared the quiet workshop as night settled over Edo. The snow continued through the evening, though it scarcely seemed determined enough to whiten the city. Each flake drifted alone through the narrow square of sky above the Nagaya, turning once or twice before settling upon a roof tile, a bucket lid, or the dark boards of the lane. Most melted at once. A few remained in sheltered corners, no thicker than scattered grains of rice. Hana stood at the workshop entrance with one hand extended. A flake touched her sleeve and vanished, leaving only a small dark spot upon the cotton. "It will not stay," she said. "Not tonight," Seibei replied. He closed the outer shutter against the cold. The flakes disappeared from view, but the room retained the particular quiet that snow brought, as if the whole city had lowered its voice to listen. Oharu added charcoal to the brazier. The three of them sat close to its warmth. Beyond the thin walls, neighbors spoke softly and moved bedding nearer their own fires. Someone at the well hurried through the last bucket of the evening. The gatekeeper's broom scraped once across the lane, then stopped when there was nothing useful left to sweep. Hana placed the faded scrap from the landscape lantern inside a small wooden box where she kept practice papers, loose threads, and objects whose purposes had not yet revealed themselves. The gray-blue stroke looked very small there. She closed the lid. During the night, the temperature fell. When Hana woke before dawn, the room felt different. Cold pressed through the shutters and gathered along the floor. She descended from the loft, wrapped her robe tightly, and slid open a narrow panel. The lane had turned white. Snow rested on the roofs, the well cover, the gate beam, and every ledge broad enough to hold it. The packed earth below was marked only by the gatekeeper's first footprints. Even the familiar refuse baskets and water jars had softened into quiet, rounded shapes. For several breaths, Hana did not move. Edo had not vanished, yet its rough edges had been hidden. The narrow Nagaya lane seemed wider beneath the pale morning light. Sounds arrived clearly. A distant temple bell, the creak of a roof beam, the muffled thud of snow slipping from an eave. Oharu came beside her. "So, Genshichi has his wish," she said. They ate breakfast quickly and dressed for the cold. Seibei insisted that the workshop could not remain closed for an excursion, but there were few customers likely to visit so early after snow. He placed a notice near the shutter and asked the sandal maker to listen for anyone who came. Then the three set out toward Ryogoku. The larger streets had already begun to lose their whiteness. Porters, servants, vendors, and carts pressed the snow into gray slush. Shopkeepers swept their thresholds with broad brooms, pushing small ridges toward the gutters. Children gathered clean handfuls from walls and roofs before adults could stop them. On quieter roads, the city still held its winter brightness. Temple roofs wore smooth white layers. Pine branches bent beneath the weight, their dark needles showing through. Red gates and blue shop curtains appeared richer against the snow. Smoke rose from cooking fires in straight columns until a light wind carried it over the rooftops. Hana's sandals left neat prints at first, then dampened as the snow entered around their edges. Oharu looked down at them. "Travelers know how to be wet," Hana said. "And the skill is becoming dry again," Seibei replied. Near Nihonbashi, the canal reflected a sky almost as white as the banks. Boats still moved through the water, though crews worked cautiously where snow had gathered upon decks and landing steps. Men unloaded baskets of fish while breathing steam into the cold air. The market had not paused for beauty. Farther east, the streets opened toward the Sumida. Genshichi had been correct. Ryogoku looked larger beneath snow. The opposite bank seemed farther away, its roofs blending into the pale sky. Boats crossed dark water between whitened embankments. The bridge rails carried narrow caps of snow wherever passing hands had not brushed them clear. Genshichi's tea shop glowed at the entrance. Fresh lanterns hung beneath the eaves, their paper bright against the winter morning. Inside, near a shelf of tea jars, Hana saw the repaired plum lantern burning softly. It had been cleaned, but not made new. The seam between its papers remained visible. Its painted blossoms shone above a low brazier where two customers warmed their hands. Genshichi greeted them with satisfaction. "You came. You left us no excuse," Oharu said. He served hot tea and small cakes made from pounded rice. Hana sat where she could see both the lantern and the river beyond the doorway. Snow continued to fall from the tea shop roof in small, soft collapses. Each time it dropped, passers-by stepped aside. A dog shook powder from its back. Two boys rolled a ball of snow along the edge of the street until it gathered dirt and straw. Genshichi noticed Hana watching the plum lantern. "It gives better light indoors," he said. "It gave enough light outside. It gave enough to be broken twice." Hana smiled into her cup. The lantern's painted branch belonged to another season, yet in the warm room it did not seem misplaced. Plum trees would bloom again before long. Their buds were already held within bare branches somewhere beyond the snow. After tea, the family walked to the bridge. The Sumida moved dark and steady below. Snowflakes touched its surface and disappeared instantly, leaving no trace. Along the banks, trees stood bare. The places where crowds had viewed cherry blossoms and summer fireworks now appeared almost empty. Hana remembered the year in layers. She saw spring lanterns beneath flowering branches, festival lights reflected in rainwater, gold sparks opening over the river, and autumn moonlight resting on the canal. None remained before her, yet the bridge, the water, and the city had carried them all. Seibei rested his hands upon the rail. "A lantern would look well from a boat today," Hana said. "The paper would become wet. Then, from the shore, the wind would trouble it." Oharu looked toward the quiet river. "You might allow the snow to remain snow." Hana considered this. A flock of gulls passed above the water, their gray wings almost disappearing against the sky. On the far bank, someone in a dark robe crossed an open stretch of white ground, leaving a single trail of footprints behind. They turned home before midday. The streets were changing again. Snow slid from roofs, dripped from signboards, and dissolved beneath the traffic. Water ran along the gutters. By afternoon, only shaded corners and temple grounds would preserve the morning. At the workshop, a customer was waiting. He stood beneath the eaves, holding a small lantern wrapped in cloth. The sandal maker had given him tea, but had not invited him inside, claiming that lantern business belonged to lantern makers. The customer was an elderly man from a nearby temple. His lantern was plain, with no painting, and only a single character marking the temple name. One panel had torn during the snow. Seibei opened the workshop. Hana removed her damp outer layer and prepared the paste. Oharu set their sandals near the brazier to dry. Within moments, the room resumed its familiar shape. Tools upon the table, paper beneath careful hands, cold air entering whenever the shutter moved. Outside, the white lane slowly darkened. Hana fitted fresh paper over the torn panel. She smoothed it once, then again, leaving no wrinkle along the edge. Seibei inspected the work. "It will hold," he said. The words were simple, but Hana felt their weight. Beyond the roof, snowmelt fell in steady drops, marking the final weeks of the year as softly as a clock. The snowmelt continued until evening, running from the roofs in narrow silver threads. By nightfall, only small white patches remained beside the well and beneath the gate, where sunlight had not reached. The lane shone with water. Every passing sandal left a dark print upon the boards, and the cold returned as soon as the sky cleared. The repaired temple lantern stood near the brazier. Its new panel was slightly brighter than the others, though Hana had chosen paper as close to the original as she could find. The elderly customer turned it in his hands and examined the seam. "You did this?" he asked. Hana glanced toward Seibei. "She did," he said. The old man nodded, neither surprised nor doubtful. He paid the agreed coins, wrapped the lantern in cloth, and carried it toward the temple as evening bells sounded beyond the roofs. Hana watched him leave. Seibei began putting away the tools. "A customer who says little may still be satisfied." "I know. You were waiting for praise." "Only a little." Oharu laughed softly from beside the brazier. The final weeks of the year brought no quiet to Edo. As the 12th month advanced, the city turned toward cleaning, settling accounts, paying debts, preparing food, replacing worn household objects, and completing every task that people had postponed through spring, summer, and autumn. Shopkeepers called upon customers, messengers hurried with bills, merchants counted coins late into the night. Households emptied cupboards, shook bedding, scrubbed floors, and swept soot from places left untouched during ordinary cleaning. The Nagaya joined the great year-end effort. On a bright morning, the gatekeeper announced the day for communal cleaning. Mats were carried into the lane and beaten. Dust rose in pale clouds before the cold wind carried it away. Children crawled beneath storage shelves in search of lost objects. Neighbors borrowed ladders, buckets, brushes, and opinions. Oharu opened every box in their room. She found scraps of cloth too small for purses but too useful to discard. 3 mismatched chopsticks, a cracked comb, several buttons, old account papers, and a sandal Hana had outgrown years before. "Why did we keep this?" she asked. Hana examined the tiny sandal. "Perhaps we expected my foot to become smaller." Seibei, who was cleaning soot from the upper wall, hid a smile. The workshop required particular care. Paper dust gathered behind shelves. Bamboo shavings slipped into cracks between floorboards. Old paste bowls had to be soaked and scraped. Brushes were washed, reshaped, and inspected beneath strong light. Hana climbed to the loft and brought down the small wooden box containing her practice designs and unfinished objects. She sorted them near the doorway. There were plum blossoms painted before the Komedo visit, irises from the rainy season, firework circles, a pressed ginkgo leaf, a strip of festival wish paper with blurred ink, and the gray-blue fragment from Jubei's landscape lantern. The fragment still showed only one faded stroke. Hana held it toward the light. She had kept it because she did not yet know why. Now, after so many months, no answer had appeared. The scrap did not prove where the lantern had traveled, who had painted it, or which water the line represented. Removed from the landscape, it was almost nothing, yet it had once belonged to something complete. She placed it back in the box. Not everything needed an immediate use. Near the bottom lay the first paper on which she had painted plum blossoms. The branch leaned awkwardly. 2 petals touched when they should not have done so. A dark drop thickened one twig. She remembered believing it fine when she made it, then poor after seeing the real trees, then precious when Genshichi hung her design nearest the tea-shop door. Now it seemed simply early. She carried the paper downstairs and placed it beside the repaired plum lantern sketch. Seibei noticed. Throwing it away? No. Then it is not cleaning. I removed dust from it. By afternoon the walls appeared lighter and the workshop larger. Finished frames hung neatly by size. Paper rolls stood upright on the driest shelf. Pigment dishes had been wrapped and labeled. Even the traveler's pine lantern was taken down, dusted, and relit when evening came. Its translucent moon appeared above the old tree. The lantern had spent autumn and winter in their room, yet Hana still imagined the road beyond it. The leaning pine no longer seemed to belong solely to its unknown painter or former owner. It carried all of them now: the traveling cellar, the market stall, Oharu's bargaining, Seibei's repair, and the nights when its quiet light had watched their work. A few days before the year's end, a letter arrived. It came through a merchant who had business along the Tokaido. The paper was folded carefully and addressed to Seibei's workshop. Inside, Jubei wrote that he had returned safely to the family inn. The old landscape lantern had survived the road. His brother had objected to displaying so fragile an object near the entrance, just as Jubei had predicted. After several days of discussion, they placed it in an inner room where travelers took tea. On clear evenings, they lit it briefly. One guest, an elderly pilgrim, had insisted that the mountains resembled Hakone. Another declared that the boats belonged upon the Sumida. Jubei offered no answer. He also wrote that snow had fallen heavily in the hills. Hana listened while Seibei read the letter aloud. She pictured the lantern shining far west of Edo, its damaged landscape receiving new interpretations from strangers resting along the road. At the bottom of the page, Jubei had added one final line. When spring came, he intended to send them a branch from the inn's plum tree, provided it flowered well. Hana smiled. We should send him a lantern in return. He has one, Seibei said. A new one. For what purpose? She thought of the inn entrance facing east, where first light reached the sign before the road. A dawn lantern. Seibei folded the letter. Then you must discover how dawn looks on paper. The idea remained with her through the year-end days. Dawn was not a single color. It began in darkness, then softened roof lines, uncovered the lane, touched upper walls, and finally entered the workshop in a narrow band. A lantern could be painted pale blue near the top and warm near the base, but that would merely show colors, not the quiet change between them. She made several sketches. None satisfied her. There would be time, Seibei said. Spring branches were still bare. Jubei's plum buds had not opened. The year itself had not yet ended. On the final evening, the Nagaya settled later than usual. Households completed their preparations. Special foods had been arranged for the coming days. Debts, where possible, had been paid. Fresh paper and sacred decorations appeared near doorways. People bathed, changed into clean clothing, and waited for the old year to pass. Seibei closed the workshop shutters. Oharu served a simple bowl of buckwheat noodles, long strands traditionally eaten at the year's turning. They sat close together in the cleaned room. The traveler's pine lantern burned beside them, and near the wall hung one newly finished lantern, plain except for a faint band of color like the first light before sunrise. It was only a trial. Outside, footsteps diminished. Voices softened. Across Edo, shopkeepers lowered shutters, temple grounds filled with visitors, and families gathered in rooms large and small. Then the bells began. From temples near and distant came slow, resonant notes, each rising over the rooftops and fading before another followed. The sounds overlapped across the city, passing over canals, bridges, castle moats, merchant streets, quiet gardens, and the dark Sumida. Hana listened from beside the brazier. The old year seemed to leave not in a single moment, but bell by bell, carried gently into the winter night. The bells continued deep into the night. Some reached the Nagaya as full, rounded tones. Others arrived faintly, softened by distance until they seemed less like sounds than movements in the darkness. Between them lay long silences in which Hana could hear charcoal settling in the brazier and the winter wind passing beneath the eaves. She tried to count the strokes, but soon lost her place. Seibei sat with his hands folded inside his sleeves. Oharu had closed her eyes, though she was not asleep. Around them, the cleaned workshop held the signs of the year just past. Bamboo stacked in orderly bundles, brushes drying above the table, repaired frames waiting for customers, and scraps of painted paper too useful or too meaningful to discard. The traveler's pine lantern glowed beside the wall. Its translucent moon had become familiar enough that Hana no longer saw only the unknown road painted upon it. She saw the market stall where the bare frame had waited, the autumn evening when the first candle revealed the tree, and all the quiet hours it had illuminated since. Near it hung the unfinished dawn lantern. Seibei had allowed Hana to use good paper for the trial. Its upper half remained nearly white, washed with the palest blue. Near the base, a thin band of muted rose passed into soft yellow. In daylight, the colors seemed uncertain. By candlelight, they warmed, but the lantern still did not truly resemble dawn. Hana looked at it whenever a temple bell faded. Perhaps dawn could not be painted because dawn was not an object. It was a change. It existed only between what had been hidden and what was about to become visible. The last bowls were cleared away. Oharu spread bedding in the loft and along the floor. Seibei extinguished the traveler's pine lantern, leaving only one practical lamp burning near the brazier. "Will we see the first sunrise?" Hana asked. "If the sky is clear," Oharu said, "and if we wake." "We will wake," Seibei replied. They slept lightly. Before dawn, the Nagaya stirred. Doors slid open. Water buckets knocked against wood. Neighbors whispered greetings in the cold. Someone sneezed 3 times near the gate. The air carried the scent of smoke, clean cloth, and food prepared for the new year. Hana dressed quickly. The 3 of them stepped outside while the sky was still dark. Frost silvered the lane, just as it had at the beginning of the year. Yet Hana no longer saw only the cold. She noticed the faint brightness behind the eastern roofs and the way every edge waited within shadow. Other residents were leaving as well. They walked toward a nearby bridge where the eastern sky could be seen above the canals and lower houses. The streets were quieter than on ordinary mornings, though small groups moved in the same direction. Some carried lanterns, others held children by the hand. Breath rose pale before every face. At the bridge they found a place near the railing. The canal below was black. Roofs formed a dark, uneven line beyond it. No color showed at first, only a slight thinning of the sky close to the horizon. Then the change began. Black became deep blue. The roofs separated from the heavens. Chimneys, poles, and bare branches emerged one by one. A band of gray appeared, followed by the faintest warmth beneath it. Hana watched without speaking. The light did not resemble her lantern. It moved too slowly to notice and too steadily to stop. Pale blue gave way to pearl. Pearl warmed toward peach. The canal began to hold the sky, though its surface remained darker and more fluid. Beside her, Seibei drew one hand from his sleeve. "Now," he said quietly. A narrow edge of sun appeared above the distant houses. It brightened rapidly, turning frost to sparks along the bridge rail. Faces became visible. Wooden walls took on color. A crow crossed the light, its wings briefly sharp against the glowing sky. No one cheered loudly. A few people bowed. Others murmured wishes for the coming year. A child lifted both hands toward the sun until his mother tucked them back into his sleeves. Hana understood what had been missing from the dawn lantern. Not a better shade of blue or a brighter band of yellow. It needed darkness below the light, something waiting to be revealed. On their return, Edo was waking into the first morning of the year. Shop shutters remained closed in many streets, but household entrances were decorated. Temple visitors moved along the roads. The city seemed rested, though beneath its quiet surface cooks tended fires, servants carried trays, and boatmen prepared for the day. At the Nagaya, greetings were exchanged. Oharu served the foods she had prepared. The room filled with steam and gentle conversation. For once, Seibei did not open the workshop immediately. Tools remained put away. Orders could wait. Later, while Oharu visited a neighbor, Hana took down the dawn lantern. She prepared a small dish of gray pigment. Along the lower edge, beneath the rose and yellow, she painted a row of dark roof lines. They were not exact buildings, only simple shapes: an eave, a chimney, a pole, the suggestion of a temple roof. Above them, she left the colors unchanged. Seibei watched from the brazier. When the paint dried, he placed a candle inside. The roof line became a silhouette. Light gathered behind it, brightest near the base and softer toward the blue above. The lantern did not show the sun itself. It showed the moment before the city fully awakened. Hana opened the frame. As it lengthened, more of the painted sky appeared. Seibei turned it once, then placed it beside the traveler's pine. "The inn faces east," Hana said. "Jubei will understand. He may. And if he does not, he will still have a lantern." They began a letter that afternoon. Seibei wrote the formal lines. Oharu added greetings. Hana explained that the lantern was meant for the inn's eastern entrance, but that it should not be left in rain. She asked Jubei to hang it before sunrise on a clear morning and to tell them whether the mountains changed its light. The lantern itself would not travel until the roads were easier and a trustworthy merchant went west. For now, it remained in the workshop, waiting. Days passed. The holiday quiet faded. Shops reopened. Vendors returned to the streets. Customers arrived with scorched panels, loose rings, torn paper, and new requests. The well rope creaked. The gatekeeper swept. Children resumed their games. The year in Edo began again through familiar motions. One mild afternoon, a messenger came from Genshichi's tea shop. The repaired plum lantern had survived the season, but its candle holder was crooked. Genshichi also wished to order 6 new lanterns before the plum blossoms opened. Seibei read the note. Hana looked toward the shelf where brushes stood ready. "Will the blossoms be early?" she asked. "They may be." Outside, frost melted from the sunlit edge of the lane. A drop fell from the eaves, then another. Beyond the crowded roofs, dark branches held buds not yet open. The Sumida continued toward the sea. Boats passed beneath Nihonbashi. Travelers entered the city and departed from it. Temple bells marked the hours, while ordinary people swept thresholds, prepared meals, counted coins, carried water, repaired what had broken, and made useful things beautifully. Seibei selected a fresh strip of bamboo. Hana placed the dawn lantern beside the work table and began grinding ink. Oharu opened the shutters. Winter light entered the room, pale at first, then steadily brighter, revealing paper, brushes, careful hands, and the first unfinished frame of another quiet year in Edo.